The story of Karbala is one of the most misunderstood moments in Islamic history, surrounded by legends and myths with very few accounts verifiably transmitted. Yet it's become a religion to some and a traumatic moment for others. And at the center of it all is perhaps the most vilified person in all of Islamic history. This is the story of the first Umayyad rulers, from the caliphate of Muawiyah to the kingdom of Yazid. And inshallah, all of the questions and misconceptions will be answered. And perhaps you will realize that there was more to the story than what you may have originally thought. Because while Karbala was a great tragedy, an even greater one would soon follow when the entire city of Medina was put under siege, and what happened next is almost impossible to retell.
Banu Umayyah.
Long before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, his great-grandfather Hashim was entrusted with the responsibility of feeding the pilgrims in Mecca and organizing the yearly Hajj. And with his high position, as well as his wealth and his status, he managed to convince the Arabs to cooperate in a collective trade route flowing from Yemen to Syria, with Mecca in the center. This trade route would be known as the caravan of the winter and summer, رحلة الشتاء والصيف, and it would bring untold wealth to the people of Mecca. And because of this, Hashim would rise within his society, being given a prestige and status that no one else had. And soon he would become one of the great leaders of the Arabian Peninsula. But this success and his prestige didn't go uncontested, and soon someone from within his own family would try to outshine him. Hashim's twin brother Abd al-Shams had a son by the name of Umayyah. And whenever Umayyah would hear of Hashim's success, he grew envious of him and would try to outdo him, holding larger banquets, giving more to the pilgrims, and showing off a greater display of wealth. But eventually, this competition grew more hostile, and Umayyah publicly challenged Hashim to a contest of boasting. These contests were known as munaffara, with each side reciting poetry and giving speeches to brag about their own lineage and accomplishments while putting the other side down. It was almost like an ancient form of a rap battle, but the stakes were much, much higher. But Umayyah soon lost, and as part of the terms of the battle, he was forced to give 50 camels to Hashim and leave the city for 10 years in exile. This battle of boasting may have seemed insignificant at the time, but both Hashim and Umayyah's children would grow into clans within the Quraysh, and a rivalry between the two would persist long after Islam came to the region and the Prophet ﷺ lived and passed away. These two clans were known as Banu Umayyah and Banu Hashim. And whenever one side managed to gain prestige and clout, the other side had to try to outdo them and bring something even bigger or better. They competed in charity and hospitality and in feeding the pilgrims. They competed in diplomatic relationships with other tribes to see who could make the biggest deals. But eventually Banu Hashim came with something that Banu Umayyah could simply never come up with: a prophet from Allah would be a guide for all of the people of this world. And at that, many of the leaders of Banu Umayyah became extremely jealous, and they refused to believe in Islam. How could they follow a prophet of Allah when he came from the rival clan? The exception to this rule, of course, was Uthman ibn Affan, who became one of the earliest converts to Islam. And he went on against the rest of Banu Umayyah and dedicated his life and his wealth to the cause. But most of Banu Umayyah only became Muslim after the conquest of Mecca, when they finally realized that Islam was victorious and they knew that there was no point in resisting. And among them, of course, was Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, the leader of Banu Umayyah and the father of Muawiyah. He had become the default ruler of all of Mecca, while the rest of the Qurayshi leaders had died in the Battle of Badr. But now that he had submitted himself to Islam, he decided to prove his loyalty and make up for all of those years that he had fought against the Prophet ﷺ. And so he joined the Prophet ﷺ in the Battle of Hunayn, and with him was Muawiyah and Yazid, his other son. Together they fought valiantly against the enemies of Islam, and Abu Sufyan even lost an eye in fighting. But when the Muslims were finally victorious that day, the Prophet ﷺ gave both Abu Sufyan and Muawiyah a gift: 100 camels each, a mini fortune to soften their hearts towards Islam and to reward them for overcoming their arrogance against Banu Hashim. But Banu Umayyad's new loyalty to Islam didn't stop at the death of the Prophet ﷺ. They continued to serve the Muslims under Abu Bakr and Omar, joining the conquests of Syria and Palestine in fighting against the Romans. In the Battle of Yarmouk, Abu Sufyan lost his second eye, becoming blind in his old age. But as for Yazid and Muawiyah, they continued to fight on until eventually these lands were taken by the Muslims. Abu Bakr then appointed Yazid the governor of Syria, owing to his talent for diplomacy. But Yazid soon died from a plague and he was replaced by his brother Muawiyah. And Muawiyah would go on to be the only governor who was never removed from his position. There, Muawiyah served for 22 years under the caliphates of Omar and Uthman. And during that time, the people of Syria became extremely loyal to him as he had ruled over them effectively with a level of justice they had never seen before. And so it's no surprise when Ali became the Khalifa, the people of Syria supported Muawiyah over him and were even willing to fight a war on Muawiyah's behalf. Soon after the first fitna, Ali passed away and his son Hassan became the next Khalifa. But Hassan preferred to step down and to prevent another civil war from happening. And so he gave up his caliphate and handed it to Muawiyah. And Muawiyah now became the undisputed leader of the Muslims, and once more the caliphate was united. And because another civil war had been averted, the people celebrated that year, calling it Aam al-Jama'ah, the year of unity.
There's a misconception that the history of Islam is limited to the Middle East, and yet today we find that the vast majority of the ummah comes from places elsewhere. This is one of the reasons I'm writing this book, the entire history of Islam. And in fact, it was the original reason why I started this channel in the first place, half a decade ago. It was to highlight the amazing stories of Muslim heroes and nations throughout the entire history of our ummah. In this book, I've dedicated entire chapters to some of the more unknown regions with immensely rich Muslim history. So go to my website and pre-order the book now. And if you pre-order, I will literally write your name into the book so that future generations know and recognize that it was you who was the reason that this book could even exist in the first place. May Allah give your name a legacy that the ummah will never forget. Ameen.
The kingdom of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan.
Although Muawiyah was nowhere near the ranks of the rightly guided Khalifas, he was still one of the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, and he was even given a number of special virtues. Most of the reports say that Muawiyah converted to Islam at the conquest of Mecca, but there is one report which may suggest that he converted 2 years earlier, but had kept his Islam secret. Muawiyah once said, "The Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, entered Mecca during the Umrah al-Qada, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and I believed in him. Then when the year of the conquest of Mecca began, I declared my conversion to Islam, and so I came to him and he welcomed me, and I wrote the Quran in his presence." Writing the Quran in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ was one of the most prestigious tasks given to a Muslim. He was taking the recitation of the Prophet ﷺ and preserving it in ink. And to be chosen for this task, not only did he need to be highly educated, but the Prophet ﷺ must have also had a high level of trust for him as well. One of the reasons for the Prophet ﷺ's trust in him may have been the fact that Muawiyah was his own brother-in-law. You see, Muawiyah's own sister, Habib, was one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, and through that connection, Muawiyah was a part of the family of the Prophet ﷺ, and from that, of course, a bond would have grown between them. There's no doubt that the Prophet ﷺ wanted good for Muawiyah, and he believed that he would rise to become a great leader. After all, his father, Abu Sufyan, had been the ruler of Mecca, and all of the rest of Banu Umayyah had been heavily involved in politics. And so, the Prophet ﷺ made a special dua for him, asking Allah to make Muawiyah a guide for the people and for him to be given guidance. O Allah, make him a guide who is himself rightly guided, and guide others through him. These are some of the many virtues of Muawiyah, and they are the reason why we don't doubt his character. But despite these virtues, there are a number of strange decisions that he took during his reign, and many people can't help but wonder, what was their purpose? Under Muawiyah, the governors became inaccessible, and the people were not able to easily approach them and question their decisions. This was even seen inside the masjids, where the rulers would pray in their own curtained-off sections. A court system was also developed with a throne and a crown and an official seal. The governors also began to wear luxurious clothes and live in palaces far above the people. But there were many reasons for those decisions, and they weren't as nefarious as some people like to imagine. And most of them were taken with either security or state stability in mind. You see, Muawiyah had inherited an extremely volatile empire, and out of the last 5 rulers, 3 of them were assassinated, with 2 of the assassinations having taken place in the masjid during prayer. Muawiyah himself had been assassinated in the masjid, and so he decided to create a curtained-off section for himself and place a guard at the entrance. This was the reason he made the governors inaccessible to the people. There was always a fear that the people could attack them just as they had done with the previous caliphs. But then there was the issue of luxury and palaces, none of which had anything to do with security or with preventing attacks. Rather, when Muawiyah first began to govern Syria, he quickly realized that he was in a land that had been used to extravagance of the Romans. The people there did not respect those who were frugal. They saw them as stingy and poor and undeserving of respect. And then there were guests he would invite for diplomatic relations. They expected lavish gifts and luxurious palaces to host them. Luxury and opulence became one of the cornerstones of his diplomacy while he was dealing with the various nations between the Muslim lands and the Roman Empire. It was much cheaper and easier to bribe people than to go to war with them. And when diplomats and other nations saw him in expensive robes surrounded by an entourage of guards, they would rightfully assume that his military was also powerful and well organized. Appearances were everything. And so an elaborate court system was established. He wore a crown and sat on a throne and had people request a meeting with him in order for him to then give them an audience. The official seal was also important, considering how Uthman had been killed because of a fake document. No longer could letters be forged and fabricated as easily as before, and now the seal would stay in the court under the protection of the guards who stood on patrol each night. And as proof that these changes were made with the best of intentions, consider that Muawiyah had made many of these changes during the lifetime of Umar ibn al-Khattab. When Umar had appointed Muawiyah as the governor of Syria, he began hearing stories of his opulence and complaints that people could not easily reach him. And so he traveled to Syria personally to meet Muawiyah in person and question him on what he was doing. Umar asked him, "Muawiyah, were you the one with that grand procession just now, on top of what I've heard about people with needs being made to wait at your door?" Muawiyah replied, "Yes, Amir al-Mu'mineen." And so Umar asked, "Why is that?" Muawiyah answered, "Because we are in a land where the enemy's spies are many, and there must be something that strikes fear with the awe of the ruler. If you command me to do this, I'll keep it, and if you forbid me, I will stop." At that, Omar said, "If what you have said is true, then it is a shrewd policy. And if it is false, then it is a clever ruse. I neither command you nor forbid you." For the next 19 years, Muawiyah ruled over the Muslims from his capital city in Syria. And none of the Sahaba objected to his election, nor were there any rebellions throughout his entire rule. By far, he had the most stable and most successful reign out of any of his predecessors. He was a master politician and one of the greatest statesmen in all of history. Under his rule, the Muslims had a long-lasting peace. There were no civil wars, there were no uprisings, and the Muslims enjoyed their lives in great prosperity. Muawiyah also invested in developing the economy and building infrastructure around the Muslim world. Roads were laid and dams and bridges were built, and trade between the different lands boomed as caravans could travel in safety. And then there was the expansion of the empire as the Muslims continued their conquest into new territories. Under Muawiyah, the city of Qarwain was founded in Tunisia, becoming the administrative capital for the Muslim forces in the region. And at the same time, a proper navy was also developed, and the Muslims now began patrolling the seas and securing trade routes across the Mediterranean Sea. But as the years passed by, Muawiyah's age began to catch up with him, and the question of his succession began to arise. Who would be the next Khalifa after him? And what would happen to the Muslims Would there be another civil war or a series of assassinations? Would the people of Syria refuse to relinquish power after they had lost so many men in the Battle of Siffin? And what if a member of Banu Hashim was chosen, the rival clan of Banu Umayyah? Would there be a conflict between the two sides? After all, despite the rise of Islam, the issues of tribalism still continued to play a role in politics, and these things needed to be taken into account when choosing a new leader for the Muslims. All of these issues weighed down on Muawiyah as he knew his days were numbered. And from his experience throughout his 41 years of rule, he knew the chaos that would come after his death. So perhaps, to avoid another civil war from happening, he made the most controversial decision of his entire career. And while he may have thought it wise at the time, soon enough, the very decision he made would become the catalyst for what he was trying to prevent. And that decision, of course, was to choose his own son as the next Khalifa. And by doing so, he had set a precedent that nearly all rulers after him would follow. Now, Banu Umayyah would become the permanent rulers, and their kingdom would become a dynasty. This is why some people call it the Umayyad kingdom, a name to represent the fact that only one family now ruled over all others.
The rise of Yazid ibn Muawiyah.
You will surely conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful commander and army. Yazid ibn Muawiyah was named after his uncle, the beloved older brother of Muawiyah, who had died from a plague during the caliphate of Omar. And now that Muawiyah had chosen Yazid to succeed him on his throne, he had to find a way to convince the people to accept him. And what a better way to bring prestige to Yazid's name than to have a direct endorsement from the Prophet ﷺ himself. So Muawiyah decided to put Yazid at the head of his new navy. And he sent him off to the lands of the Romans, where he was to conquer their capital city. Now, the Muslims had done this before. In fact, the capital of the Muslims at that time was the city of Damascus, one of the greatest cities in the history of the world, and one that had been wrested from the hands of the Romans. And then there was the city of Ctesiphon, the capital city of the Persians. This was the empire that had matched the Romans in their civilization and power, but the Muslims had defeated them and taken the city for themselves. And now the entire empire was being ruled under the kingdom of Muawiyah. So why couldn't they take Constantinople too? And if Yazid were to lead the conquest, he would clearly be seen as a suitable successor to the throne. So the ships were then prepared and the navy was sent, and they traveled through the Mediterranean Sea until they reached the Dardanelles. But the Romans had a new weapon that they called Greek fire that they attached to their ships. These were giant flamethrowers that burned everything in front of them. Unable to survive these attacks, the Muslims were forced to land their ships and march to Constantinople on foot. Eventually their armies arrived and they managed to surround the capital city, but without any naval support, breaking through the city's defenses would be nearly impossible. Still, the Muslims attacked, and several times they tried to get through, but with each attempt the Romans attacked back and many people were killed in the battle. The most famous incident of this battle was the death of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He was the Sahabi in whose house the Prophet ﷺ stayed when he first arrived in Medina. Now Abu Ayyub was nearly 80 years old, and during the battle he fell ill. And knowing that his life was coming to an end, he asked the Muslims to take him as close as they could to the fortress of the city. And soon he was put to rest beneath the walls of the Romans, far into the lands of the enemy, where no Muslim had been buried before. Yazid himself would lead his funeral prayer. As Constantinople grew over the centuries, it eventually extended beyond its original walls, and it encompassed Abu Ayyub's grave. Today there is a masjid to mark where his grave is, and it's in the neighborhood what's called Ayyub Sultan in Istanbul, the modern name, of course, of Constantinople. The first siege of the Roman capital would ultimately fail, and Yazid was forced to return to Damascus. He would not be the great conqueror of Constantinople that the Prophet ﷺ had foretold, but Muawiyah still needed to find a way to get the people to approve Yazid. So he made Yazid the emir of Hajj as a way to endear him to the people. For 3 years in a row, Yazid gave the khutbahs of Hajj and led the people in prayer. And during that time, Muawiyah would join him in Hajj and campaign for his candidacy, asking the people to pledge an oath of allegiance to his son while he was still their Khalifa. Of the people that gave their allegiance were Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Abbas. These were two sons of the great Sahaba, Umar and Abbas, and they were among the greatest scholars and leaders of their time. But many other sons of the great Sahaba either decided to remain neutral or outright reject Yazid. And among those were Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Hussein ibn Ali. A rift was now beginning to form, and the people of Medina were splitting off into two camps: those who would approve of Yazid's rise to power and those who would reject. But while Muawiyah was still alive, the Muslims would remain united, and this issue remained relatively unimportant. It was only when he died a few years later that the Muslims fell back into the throes of chaos. O Allah, do not let me live to see the year 60. O Allah, do not let me live to see the rule of the young men. This was a dua that Abu Hurairah used to make frequently. And it was clear that the Prophet ﷺ had warned him about something. And this dua was ultimately accepted by Allah, as he would die in the year 59 Hijri, 1 year before. Muawiyah, on the other hand, died in 60 Hijri. And soon after, another prophecy would be fulfilled. The rule of the young men that Abu Hurairah so feared would finally become a reality.
The beginning of the second fitna.
When Muawiyah passed away after 41 years of ruling from Damascus, his son Yazid was then placed on the throne and crowned the Khalifa over all of the Muslims. But in order for him to solidify his claim, he would need the approval of the people. This meant going back to Medina and getting an oath of allegiance from their leaders. But when he arrived in Medina, he found the same split in opinion. One group of the Sahaba and their sons approved him, and the other group rejected him. Of those who approved Yazid was Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of Umar ibn Khattab, and Abdullah ibn Abbas. The son of Abbas was the uncle, of course, of the Prophet ﷺ. Those who rejected Yazid were Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the son of Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, and Hussein ibn Ali, the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Abdullah ibn Umar was by far the most senior of them, and he had once even been suggested as the next Khalifa when his own father was on his deathbed. But Umar ibn Khattab refused to allow anyone else in his family to rule over the Muslims. Umar said, "It is enough for the house of al-Khattab that one man be held accountable before Allah for the affairs of the Muslims." Umar was undoubtedly on another level of piety, and his son Abdullah ibn Umar was known to follow closely in the footsteps of his father. Abdullah ibn Umar argued that Yazid had the army and he was clearly in power, and anyone who had sworn an oath to him while Muawiyah was still alive was still required to keep it. And if a consensus had been reached on who the Khalifa was, it now became obligatory to follow him even if he was oppressive. I'll be discussing the issue of obeying oppressive rulers and their legitimacy a little bit later in this video. The consensus he was referring to had clearly been reached in Damascus, but over there in Medina, there were still a few people who rejected Yazid. Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Hussein had a number of issues with accepting Yazid as the next Khalifa. Some of the issues had to do with the way that he was being elected. Others had to do with Yazid's qualifications as a pious and just ruler. First, there was the issue of the contract Muawiyah had signed when Hassan abdicated the throne. In that contract, Muawiyah had agreed that after he died, the choice of the next Khalifa would be given to the people. Then there was the issue of forcing the choice of the next leader down the people's throats. Yazid and his family were coming in and threatening anyone who did not support them. And while Muawiyah had been training Yazid in the arts of politics and warfare, Yazid had lived in the palaces of Damascus his entire life and was isolated from the masses. How could someone like this know justice and fairness when he had no real connection with the people? All of these factors concerned Abdullah bin Zubayr and Hussein, and so they refused to pledge their allegiance to him. But the situation for Hussein was particularly complicated because he was the son of Ali. It was not long ago that Ali had fought Muawiyah at the Battle of Siffin, and many people from Banu Umayyah still blamed him for the tragedy. Some of them had even lost friends and family in the fighting, and they now harbored a resentment against Ali and his children. and a few of them began to curse him and his family and even the rest of Banu Hashim. Among them was Marwan ibn al-Hakim, who had previously been the secretary of Uthman. He had been on Aisha's side against Ali during the Battle of the Camel, and under Muawiyah he was appointed the governor of Medina, and he ruled over Hassan and Hussein. And every Friday he would end his khutbahs by cursing Ali and his family in front of them. But he was eventually removed from his position, and Walid ibn Utbah, another member of the Banu Umayyah, came in his place. And he too had a feud with Hussein. This time a land dispute. Eventually Hussein managed to fight for his rights and get his property back. But the relationship between the two remained bitter. And now that Yazid had succeeded his father, Marwan and Utbah saw an opportunity to get rid of Hussein once and for all. While the governors of Medina had feuds with Hassan and Hussein, it seemed that Muawiyah was on cordial terms with them. Every year he would send them the money and the gifts that he had promised to them, and he never denied them any of their rights. They called Yazid to Medina to get their oath of allegiance from the people, and in particular to question Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Hussein, and to kill them if they refused. One by one they were brought into a room and asked to swear their allegiance, but each one gave a diplomatic answer, saying it was better to give their oaths in public and not behind closed doors. So this was accepted from them, and they were told to come back in the morning so that they could swear their oaths in the masjid. But Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Hussein snuck out of the city and fled at night, knowing that Medina was no longer safe for them. When they entered the deserts, they then turned their horses towards the city of Mecca, a sanctuary for all people. There they would be safe under the protection of the Haram, a land that was deemed sacred by Allah, and all killing was forbidden.
ومن دخله كان آمنا.
The Massacre of Karbala.
The Prophet ﷺ woke up with red soil in his hand, which he was kissing. He said, Jibreel alayhi salam informed me that this one, Hussein, will be killed in the land of Iraq. And so I said to Jibreel, show me the soil of the land in which he will be killed. And this is the soil. The story of Karbala is one of the least authentically documented, yet most written about stories in all of the history of Islam. And while many early historians had attempted to preserve the details of what exactly happened, they often used narrations from known liars and fabricators, such as Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi and Abu Mikhnaf al-Azdi. Abu Mikhnaf in particular wrote one of the earliest accounts of the story of Karbala in his book Maqtal Hussein. But this book was full of fabrications and exaggerations with very little trustworthy narration. But what makes the situation even more complicated is the fact that a second edition of this book was released some 400 years later. And in this second edition, written by an unknown author, the lies and the fabrications were exaggerated even more, and many new details were added, thus completely removing it from all historical accuracy. The second edition of this book is widespread today and has become the most popular source of information on Karbala that modern Sunni preachers and thinkers use unknowingly. But it is a fabrication of what actually happened. But despite all of this, there are some narrations that are more authentic than others. And from these few narrations, we can piece together a general picture of what happened, though the details still remain elusive. When Hassan left Kufa after abdicating the throne to Muawiyah, the people of Kufa would send letters to him asking him to come back and return to his place as their Khalifa. But eventually Hassan was poisoned, and now the letters were directed to Hussein. And now that Yazid was in power, the letters flooded in, calling on Hussein to return to their city. They promised him that they would support him against Yazid, as they believed he was the true successor to the caliphate. And it seems to be that after spending some time in Mecca, Hussein began to consider moving to Kufa, being persuaded by these letters. And while the popular story says that all of his friends and family warned him not to go, none of these reports are actually authentic. Rather, we have reports that Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Abbas advised him against it, while Abdullah ibn Zubayr was in favor of it. Eventually, Hussein decided to send one of his close relatives, Muslim ibn Aqil, to go to Kufa ahead of him and to see if the Kufans were truthful. There, Ibn Aqil met with the leaders of Kufa, who all pledged their allegiance to Hussein. And so Ibn Aqil then sent a message to Hussein telling him what had happened and that the people would support him when he arrived. So Hussein then gathered around 70 of his closest relatives and they all set off towards the city of Kufa. Soon word got out that Hussein was traveling to Kufa and that many of the Kufans even had left their city to go out and to meet him along his journey. But the Kufans weren't the only ones to notice this movement. Yazid and his spies soon discovered what was taking place in Kufa, and he sent Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad to replace the governor there and execute Muslim ibn Aqil. Ubaydullah then sent an army of around 4,000 men to block Hussein in his path. It mostly consisted of soldiers from Kufa, but its leaders were all from Damascus. There, they demanded that Hussein pledge allegiance to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad directly, but Hussein refused, saying that he would travel to Yazid in Damascus and pledge his allegiance to him there directly instead. During this stalemate, it seems that the Kufans who had joined Hussein's caravan switched sides, and they went to the army of Ubaydullah. The letters they had sent to Hussein would incriminate them, so perhaps they abandoned him now, hoping to be forgiven for joining Hussein, and perhaps their lives would be spared. But eventually, this stalemate ended when the army attacked Hussein and his family. This was a caravan of civilians with women and children. They had no chance to fight back against 4,000 soldiers. But there are so many contradictory stories as to what exactly happened. One of the most famous of these stories is how Shimr ibn Dhil Jawshan was the one to kill Hussein. He was a man who had fought under the command of Ali in the Battle of Siffin, but now he had betrayed Ali's son and joined the other side. And although the rest of the story is likely true, in reality Shimr most likely was not the one to deliver the final blow to Hussein. That dishonor goes to a man by the name of Sinan ibn Anas, who admitted to killing him with his own sword and spear. Sinan ibn Anas, the killer of Hussein, entered upon Hajjaj. Al-Hajjaj then asked, "Are you the one who killed Hussein?" Sinan said, "Yes." Al-Hajjaj asked, "How did you do it?" Sinan replied, "I speared him and struck him with a sword." Al-Hajjaj said, "You two will never be together in the same place in the Akhirah." This was one of the greatest tragedies the Ummah had ever seen. The beloved grandson of the Prophet ﷺ now lay dead on the red soil of Iraq, just as the Prophet ﷺ had prophesied. And even though Yazid and Banu Umayyah were in power at the time, the people saw the Kufans were to blame, as they had led Hussein into a trap and killed him with their own swords. A man asked Abdullah ibn Omar about the blood of mosquitoes. Ibn Omar said, "From where are you?" The man replied, "From Iraq." Ibn Omar said, "Look at that. He's asking me about the blood of mosquitoes while they, the Iraqis, have killed the grandson of the Prophet. I have heard the Prophet ﷺ saying, they, Hassan and Hussein, are my two sweet-smelling flowers in this world." Many people tried to cover for Yazid and put all of the blame on Abdullah ibn Ziyad and the people of Kufa. They say that there's no proof that Yazid ordered this and that Hussein had been willing to swear his allegiance to him. But this cannot absolve Yazid of all guilt, as these men reported to him directly. He had been the one to appoint these men, and he had set the events in motion. And in the end, he did not punish Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad for what he had done. After the massacre, the army then took the survivors of the caravan and brought them to Kufa. And the head of Hussein was then cut off from his body and delivered to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad on a silver plate. But as the surviving family of Hussein had been paraded through the streets of Kufa, they saw the people wailing and screaming, tearing their garments apart, scratching their faces and striking their cheeks. According to Shia sources, when Ali ibn Hussein, also known as Zayn al-Abidin, who had survived the massacre, saw this, he rebuked them, saying, "These people are weeping over us, but who killed us other than them?" This became the tradition of some of the people of Kufa, and it even continues on with some Shia traditions even until today. There's a misconception that this event was the catalyst of the splitting of Shi'ism from the rest of the Islamic world. However, Shi'ism actually developed its own theology and traditions long after this event. So I'll be discussing more on Shi'ism and its origin when I get to the video on the Abbasid Caliphate.
The destruction of Medina.
My father told me that there will be a ram by whom Mecca's sanctity will be violated. I do not wish to be that ram. Hussein ibn Ali. If this narration is true, then what Ali was saying to his son, Hussein, was that there would be a man in Mecca whose presence in the city would cause the sanctity of the haram to be violated. This may have been one of the reasons why Hussein chose to leave Mecca, fearing that his enemies would come for him and massacre all those who tried to protect him. But Hussein was ultimately killed outside of Mecca, and the haram's sanctity remained unviolated. So if this were a true prophecy that Ali had heard from the Prophet ﷺ, then in order for it to be fulfilled, another man would have to come and be the cause of the bloodshed. Little did Abdullah ibn Zubayr know, he would be that man. Initially, Abdullah ibn Zubayr had fled from Yazid at the same time as Hussein, and they ended up in Mecca together. He was also one who advised Hussein to leave, thinking that he would find support among the people of Kufa. But when the news arrived from Karbala that Hussein and his family had been massacred, the people of Mecca and Medina were shocked. Never could they have imagined that Yazid would commit such a crime. Dozens of the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of the Prophet ﷺ, were killed in an instant, and he was the one responsible. And so the people of Mecca, they went to Abdullah ibn Zubayr and they gave him their oaths of allegiance. And soon after, the people of Medina followed them, abandoning Yazid and the Umayyads. This was a declaration of war against Yazid, and they knew what was going to follow. Now the two cities began to raise their armies in preparation for another war. But to Yazid's credit, he sent one of the Ansar of the Prophet ﷺ to go to Medina and to try to reason with the people. But the people of Medina were set on avenging Hussein, and they were now preparing for a rebellion. So Yazid understood that war was inevitable, and he began his own preparations as well. The following year, Yazid's army was ready, and they marched towards Medina. And when they arrived in the city, they were to give the people 3 days to decide their fate. If they surrendered within that time, the people would be forgiven. But if they decided to fight, then the army would be given permission for 3 days to do whatever it pleased. This was the city of the Prophet ﷺ that they were now surrounding. And in it, many of his Sahaba still lived. What Yazid was threatening had never been done in the history of the ummah. He was talking about killing and pillaging and violating the women. Who could have imagined that these threats would come true? But Yazid had already shown his true colors in the massacre of Karbala. The days now counted down, one after the other, but the people of Medina refused. They believed that they were on the truth and that they were ready to fight, but soon they would realize they made a huge mistake. On the 4th day, the two armies lined up outside the gates of the city, but Yazid's army was several times larger and much better equipped, and they simply crushed the Medinans in an overwhelming attack. Quickly, Yazid's army entered the city, and for the next 3 days, they killed and tortured thousands of people. Babies were ripped from the hands of their mothers and decapitated, while countless women were violated in horrendously vile attacks. The sanctity of the city had been completely desecrated, and the people of Medina suffered an unbelievable fate. This was supposed to be a fellow Muslim army, but in those 3 days they lost all of their humanity, and will leave them to Allah to decide how they will fare on the Day of Judgment. This battle was known as the Battle of al-Harra, and it shook the ummah with an unbelievable shaking. But everyone knew that this was only the beginning, as the great city of Mecca was still standing in defiance. The writing was on the wall. The sacred haram was next. Does anyone who believes in Allah and the last day love Yazid?
How could Muslims commit such crimes?
When I first read about this story, how Muslims committed such egregious crimes, even in the sacred city of Medina, and even against other Muslims, I was genuinely shocked. Never would I have expected that Muslims could stoop to such low levels, though perhaps this was because I had an idealistic perception of Muslim history and not a realistic one. I had believed that Muslims throughout history acted with perfect respect to the law and carried pure and moral hearts in their chests that would never allow them to oppress others. I thought that the crimes that the Muslims committed all around us today were somehow unique to this modern era that we lived in today. But the story of Islam really is the story of humanity. In it, you will see times of war and times of peace, times of chaos and of freedom, in times of oppression and times of justice. You will find moments of greatness and glory when the Muslims chose Allah and Islam over all else, and they spread justice across the lands. But you will also find those moments of despair and darkness when the Muslims have oppressed each other and corruption began to sow its seeds in the land. This moment here, this sacking of Medina right after the killing of Hussein, indeed is one of the darkest moments in all of Islamic history. But these were not our crimes, and we will not be asked about them on the Day of Judgment. Rather, those who committed their crimes on that day will have to stand in front of Allah on their own. And even if they weren't punished for them in this life, they will certainly be held accountable in the next.
ولا تحسبن الله غافلا عما يعمل الظالمون إنما يؤخرهم ليوم تشخص فيه الأبصار.
For context, however, the actions of Yazid's army were not unique at the time, as it was an acceptable practice in the ancient world to give no quarter when conquering a city that didn't immediately surrender. This was a way for kings to warn their enemies not to fight back, but it was also a way to incentivize their soldiers to risk their lives in search of spoils and plunder. These soldiers were often on the road for months or even years without enjoying the company of their wives. And so just like feeding meat to animals, the conquered women would be given to those soldiers as spoils of war in order to keep their soldiers from rebelling. This is the grotesque nature of war and has been a part of the human experience since the very beginning of time. And when I read these stories repeated again and again in every single civilization, I soon realize how vastly different the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba were to the rest of those civilizations. Never has a generation of people fought wars with such mercy and care towards the enemy. Never have we seen such humanity on the battlefield that when the Prophet ﷺ conquered Mecca, the entire city was left untouched and forgiven. It was one of the greatest conquests in all of history, and yet it was completely bloodless. And many of those who were conquered that day went on to fight alongside him in future battles. The Prophet ﷺ was completely different to any other human being in history. Never did he give in to his desires and oppress his enemies. And his Sahaba, his companions, stood behind him and obeyed him in his commands, waging a war against their own souls so that they wouldn't go beyond the limits that Allah had set. There is no one like the Prophet ﷺ and no generation like the Sahaba. They were so unique and so special, and that's why we take them as our role models above anyone else. And no matter how many crimes and sins the Muslims have committed throughout history, the religion of Islam stands alone, perfected by Allah Himself. You Muslims will surely follow the mistakes of the nations before you, span by span and inch by inch. Even if they entered a lizard's hole, you would follow them.
The Caliphate of Abdullah ibn Zubayr.
With the people of Medina having now been subdued and the city now back under the control of the Umayyads, Yazid's army began to march towards Mecca. And there they surrounded the city, beginning the dreadful siege of the sacred Haram. For 2 months they pelted the city with stones, launching giant boulders from catapults and bombarding the people of Mecca. And in order to protect the Kaaba, the people constructed a large wooden structure over it, but it ultimately caught fire and burned down, and the Kaaba was severely damaged along with it. But while this was happening, Yazid suddenly passed away, and the Umayyad authority over the Muslims collapsed almost instantaneously. The army that was besieging Mecca then began negotiations with Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and eventually they packed their bags and left Mecca alone, choosing to return back to Syria and assess the situation. Yazid left behind many sons, but only one of them was old enough to rule. This was Muawiyah II, a young man in his 20s, but he was chronically ill and he preferred a life of asceticism. He was a righteous man who hated the dirty world of politics, and within a few months he went out to the people and he announced that he was abdicating the throne. By Allah, I have not tasted the sweetness of your caliphate, so why should I now drink its bitterness? At this, he revived the sunnah of Umar ibn Khattab, and he appointed a council of 6 righteous leaders to choose the next Khalifa. He then returned to his room and shut the door, and he was never seen from again. The council then appointed a man by the name of al-Dahhak ibn Qais al-Fihri to lead them in Damascus. And soon he became convinced that the right thing to do would be to pledge allegiance to Abdullah ibn Zubayr. All the other provinces of the Muslim world had already begun pledging their allegiance. It was time for the province of Syria to join them as well and to reunite the ummah. And for a moment there, it seemed as if the war had now reached its end, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr would come out victorious. Even the people of Damascus were now swearing their allegiance, accepting him as the rightful Khalifa. The terrible reign of Yazid was now over, and perhaps the days of peace would return to the people. But this hope would not last long. Marwan ibn al-Hakam and some of the other Umayyad governors met together in the town of al-Jabiyah to discuss what to do about the situation. With the killing of Hussein and the massacre of Medina and the siege of Mecca, they knew that their crimes had been too great and that they would be killed for their participation. So Marwan decided to gather his own army and claim the caliphate for himself. He then challenged the Dahhak in Damascus and fought a battle against him, with the Umayyad loyalties fighting on both sides of the war. This was known as the Battle of Marj Rahit, and the Umayyads under Marwan decisively defeated the Umayyads under al-Dahhak. Al-Dahhak himself was killed in the fighting. He had kept his oath to Abdullah ibn Zubayr until the very end, and he had sacrificed his life for the sake of uniting the Muslims. Marwan ibn al-Hakam was in control of Damascus now, and he quickly began a new campaign to reconquer the Muslim world. First, he went to the lands of Iraq, and he regained some control over the region. He then went to Egypt and secured the province under his new kingdom. The balance of power was beginning to shift back towards the Umayyads, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr was slowly being encircled. But then, all of a sudden, Marwan ibn al-Hakam passed away, and his son al-Malik ibn Marwan took over his throne. But this was not the only surprise to take place that year. Rather, from the ashes of Kufa, a new army began to rise. And all of a sudden, the battle was no longer just between Abdullah ibn Zubayr and the Umayyads, but now a third group had risen up, claiming the caliphate for themselves.
The Tawabun.
After the killing of Hussein by the Kufan people, a number of elders from the city began to grieve for Hussein, regretting what they had allowed to happen. These were all people who had sent letters to Hussein, inviting him to Kufa in the first place. But now that he had passed away, they began meeting in secret, discussing amongst themselves how they could avenge his death and take down the Umayyad dynasty. The name of this group was the Tawabun, meaning the people who had turned in repentance. Their leader was a man by the name of Sulaiman ibn Surad, and over the next few years, he preached to the people, saying that Allah would only forgive them if they sacrificed their lives and fought against the tyrannical Umayyads. Through his preaching, he managed to gather an army of 17,000 people. And when Yazid finally died, he saw an opportunity and declared war on Damascus. But when his people saw that he was actually serious in his intentions, most of them abandoned him, and his army dwindled to only 3,000 in number. Nonetheless, he was determined to carry out his mission, and he began to march to meet his death in Syria, where he would soon find the Umayyads. At the time, Marwan ibn al-Hakam was still alive, and he was busy trying to reconquer Iraq. This is when the two armies met, and the Umayyads completely destroyed them in Battle of Ain al-Warda. Most of the Tawabun were killed in the fighting, but those who survived fled back to Kufa, where they joined another man in his mission, and that man was Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, a charismatic rebel against the Umayyad dynasty.
Mukhtar al-Thaqafi.
When Hussein originally sent his cousin Muslim ibn Aqil to Kufa to see if the people were truthful. Mukhtar al-Thaqafi had been one of those to host him, letting him secretly live in his own house. But after Muslim ibn Aqil was eventually executed by the governor of Kufa, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, Mukhtar al-Thaqafi was then arrested and put into prison. And that's when the events of Karbala happened, and Hussein and his family were all killed as well. Eventually, however, Mukhtar al-Thaqafi was released from prison when Abdullah ibn Umar appealed to the authorities on his behalf. Mukhtar then traveled to Mecca and helped Abdullah ibn Zubayr defend the city against Yazid's army. But Mukhtar was charismatic and well-connected, and he was ambitious for power. And while he was in Mecca, he began butting heads with Abdullah ibn Zubayr, trying to outmaneuver him politically. Eventually, the two had a falling out, and Mukhtar was forced to leave the city. So he decided to go to Medina, where other opportunities lay. The idea was that he would go back to Kufa and raise a new army to avenge the killing of Hussein. But in order to do that, he would need the support of one of Hussein's surviving relatives in Medina. First, he went to Hussein's son, Zayn al-Abidin, but he rejected the idea outright, not wanting to be involved in more violence. But then there was Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, the brother of Hassan and Hussein from a different mother, and he neither approved nor disapproved Mukhtar's plan. All Muhammad asked was that more bloodshed would be avoided. And so with this, Mukhtar took it as an endorsement and went back to Kufa, where he began raising a new army in Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya's name. But this is where Mukhtar al-Thaqafi began to speak about a number of strange ideas. He began to claim to the Kufans that Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya was the Mahdi and that Mukhtar himself was working on behalf of him, thus making him the representative of Ahl al-Bayt. But his lies didn't stop there, and he only continued to exaggerate the story. Eventually, he began to claim that he was a prophet who was being given revelation from the angel Jibreel alayhi salam himself. Soon news of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi spread around the region, and thousands of people flocked to Kufa to support him on his mission. But this was blatant kufr that he was saying in Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya's name. And so Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya prepared to travel to Kufa himself and reveal Mukhtar as a fraud. But Mukhtar was a manipulative genius, and he began to spread a message to his people. And he said that one of the signs that Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya was the Mahdi was the miraculous fact that he could not be killed by swords. And with that, he now had thousands of people who were willing to try and slice him. They wanted to see if this miracle was true and if Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya would actually survive. And so with that, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya decided to stay in Medina and not risk his life. Mukhtar was then able to take over Kufa with the help of his followers. And a few weeks later, they fought the Battle of Khazir, leaving the Umayyad army dead on the battlefield. These were the people who had killed Hussein and massacred the people of Medina. Mukhtar kept his promise, and he avenged Hussein's killing. And even the governor who had decapitated Hussein now had his own head removed from his body. But while he had told one truth, with it came many lies, and he continued to call himself a prophet to his people. This was now well beyond ordinary politics, as he was deceiving the people and twisting the message of Islam. And so Abdullah ibn Zubayr sent an army from the city of Basra to recapture Kufa. And there they fought the battles of Madar and Harura against him. And in the end, the forces of Abdullah ibn Zubayr were victorious, and they surrounded Mukhtar in the great palace of Kufa. And for 4 months, he and his men held out in the palace until eventually he was captured and executed. After the death of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, he was seen as a martyr by his followers, and from them, a new religious movement known as the Qaysaniya emerged. This was a proto-Shia sect that invented the idea of imama, where the descendants of Ali were considered imams of the ummah that came one after another. This was the end of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, the avenger of Hussein and his family. But how sad the story must end when his lies eventually caught up with him. But now that Abdullah ibn Zubayr had been responsible for his killing, another man would soon rise up and seek his revenge. He was a fellow tribesman of Mukhtar from the tribe of Banu Thaqif, a man who would become infamous as the tyrant of Iraq. In Thaqif, there is a liar and a destroyer. The liar has already been defeated. The destroyer was soon to come.
The documentary that you're watching was taken from a book that I'm writing called The Entire History of Islam. And the reason I'm writing it is because we are a nation that has completely forgotten its history. We don't know about the Muslim king of Cambodia who tried to bring Islam to his people and was ultimately assassinated. We don't know about the brave Muslims of al-Andalus who fought off the Viking invasions. But this is our history, and our history is our identity. This is why I'm writing this book. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And if you pre-order, I will literally write your name into the book so that future generations know and recognize that it was you who was the reason that this book could even exist in the first place. May Allah give your name a legacy that the ummah will never forget. Ameen.
After the death of Yazid, the Ummah fell into strange times when a forgotten caliphate ruled from Mecca for some 9 years. And during that time, the Khalifa made the Kaaba into a rectangle, and there he used to pray in front of it while fire rained from the sky. This was a time of prophecy when the Prophet ﷺ foretold the coming of 2 men from a specific tribe, and he said that in Thaqif there is a liar and a destroyer, one that pretended he was a prophet and the other that destroyed the Kaaba. This is the story of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, who took the caliphate away from the Umayyads, and of the great tyrant Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the most feared person in the entire ummah. But how strange was it that even Hajjaj ibn Yusuf feared 2 women, and that the peacock army would soon arrive, nearly tearing down his entire kingdom.
Hajjaj ibn Yusuf and the siege of Mecca.
With Mukhtar al-Thaqafi now lying dead on the floor in his palace, the competition for the caliphate returned to the 2 original players. Abdullah ibn Zubayr was still the Khalifa ruling from Mecca, while al-Malik ibn Marwan was the Umayyad king, having taken the throne after his father's death. al-Malik ibn Marwan had been a pious man in his youth, becoming one of the great scholars and jurists of Medina. Even Abdullah ibn Omar endorsed him, telling his students that if he were to die, they should seek knowledge from him. But when his father Marwan ibn al-Hakam died, all of a sudden he was thrown into the fray of Umayyad politics. He had been chosen by his father to become the next king of the Umayyads, even though the rest of the Muslim world recognized Abdullah ibn Zubayr as the rightful Khalifa for the ummah. But politics can change a man, and that temptation was no different for al-Malik. And soon he became a decadent man and a ruthless king who was willing to kill anyone who threatened to destabilize his kingdom. This is the test of this world, and no matter how pious you are, fitness still remains. It is only after you are finally buried in the earth that temptation can no longer get you. Whoever wishes to follow a path, let him follow the path of the one who has died, for the living are not safe from fitna. Those are the Sahaba of Muhammad ﷺ, so follow in their footsteps, hold fast to their character and conduct, for they were upon true guidance. al-Malik ibn Marwan now began his campaign to regain the Umayyads' lost territories, and soon his army defeated Abdullah ibn Zubayr near the city of Baghdad. This became known as the Battle of Maskin, a decisive Umayyad victory, and now the path was open to reconquer the sacred Haram in Mecca. But this was the city that Allah had forbidden fighting in, and to conquer and to retake it meant massacring the people. None of the commanders of al-Malik's army were willing to go that far, and they refused to participate in the siege. But then, an unknown man from within the army approached the king and told him that he had seen a dream. In it, he saw himself seizing Abdullah ibn Zubayr and flaying him. So he offered himself to command and to lead his army, and he would go to Mecca and conquer the city. That man was Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, the destroyer of Banu Thaqif. The Umayyad army now marched towards Mecca, and when they arrived, they began setting up catapults in the mountains surrounding the valley. The city was then besieged and cut off from all supplies, while the people were constantly bombarded with large stones and balls of fire. And for more than 6 months, the siege continued, and the sacred Haram suffered under the barrage of missiles. But when the time came for Hajj, the army took a rest, and they allowed people into the city to continue with their rituals. Hajjaj then made a personal request to participate in Hajj, but Abdullah ibn Zubayr denied him, blocking him from entering the city. At that, Hajjaj resumed his bombardment, and many stones directly hit the Kaaba, causing significant damage. All the while, Abdullah ibn Zubayr used to pray in the Haram, undeterred by the bombs, even when they landed all around him. If you had seen Ibn al-Zubayr praying, he was like a branch swaying in the wind, while a catapult stone was falling here. Hajjaj then promised amnesty for whoever surrendered, and 10,000 people gave themselves up, weakening the city's defenses. Soon enough, most of the city had fled in fear, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr was left to defend the city with only a few supporters at his side. Hajjaj's army then came down from the mountains and began slaughtering the remaining defenders. And while many innocent people were inevitably killed, this was not done on purpose, and civilian bloodshed was intentionally avoided. Abdullah ibn Zubayr was then eventually surrounded, and the Umayyads slaughtered him beside the Kaaba. His head was then cut off and put on a stake, while his body was hung up for all to see. The Khalifa had fallen, and the second fitna had ended, and al-Malik ibn Marwan now stood alone as the sole victor, ushering in a new dynasty of Umayyad rule over the Muslim world. And while al-Malik was not as pious or as righteous as the Khalifa he had just killed, his methods proved effective, and he brought stability to a region the likes of which had not been seen since the reign of Muawiyah. Now a new era of wealth and prosperity could begin, and people from all over the ummah would enjoy safety and stability, no longer fearing the uncertainty of civil war in the caliphate. Abdul-Malik himself would go on to rule for another 20 years, and his 4 sons would follow him, becoming khalifas themselves, one after another, continuing on the legacy that he built. I saw the dead body of Abdullah ibn Zubayr hanging on the road of Medina. Abdullah ibn Omar happened to pass by it. He stood up there and he said, "May there be peace upon you, Abdullah ibn Zubayr. By Allah, I used to forbid you from this. By Allah, as far as I know, you were much devoted to fasting and prayer and to maintaining the ties of kinship. By Allah, a community of which you are considered the worst is indeed a fine community."
Who was to blame for the second fitna?
The second fitna may have been the most controversial event to have ever taken place in the history of Islam. Until this day, people are still arguing over who is to blame for the killing of Hussein, and entire religions divorced themselves from Islam, all under the banner of avenging his death. But in order to understand the Islamic perspective on these events and to take them as lessons for our own times, we first need to understand a few core concepts in Islam regarding the election and legitimacy of rulers and what we are allowed to do in case they become tyrannical. When 3 are on a journey, they should appoint one of them as their commander. At any given time, the Muslims should always have a leader, whether it is the Khalifa of the Ummah, the Emperor of the Empire, the King of the Kingdom, or the President of a country. And the Islamic objectives of this rule can be summarized into 3 main categories. One is the preserving of the religion of Islam and the worship of Allah.
الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأمروا بالمعروف ونهوا عن المنكر ولله عاقبة الأمور.
The second is maintaining unity and preventing fitna.
واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا.
The third is to establish justice in the land.
وإذا حكمتم بين الناس أن تحكموا بالعدل.
But if these are the objectives, what happens if a ruler doesn't fulfill them? What happens if he is an unjust tyrant who rules with oppression, or someone who prevents the people from establishing their prayers? A Muslim must listen to and obey the order of his ruler, whether he likes it or not, as long as his orders don't involve disobedience to Allah. But if an act of disobedience to Allah is imposed, one should not listen to it or obey. The relationship between a people and the ruler is very similar to that of a child and his parents. If a parent commands something which is halal or permissible in Islam, then the child must obey. But if a parent commands something which is haram or impermissible in Islam, then the child must disobey.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم فإن تنازعتم في شيء فردوه إلى الله والرسول إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر ذلك خير وأحسن تأويلا.
Most often than not, rulers are not completely good or completely evil. They are people just like the rest of us, who are in constant struggle between upholding justice and indulging in their desires. Sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they do things that are right, and we obey them. And sometimes they command things that are wrong, and we disobey them. But there is a difference between disobedience of a ruler and denying his legitimacy or trying to overthrow him. So when is it permissible to overthrow a ruler? And what are the consequences of such an action? The intelligent person isn't the one who merely knows good from evil, but the one who knows the lesser of two evils. In Islam, when a choice of two evils is presented, we must choose the lesser evil to prevent a greater harm from happening. And in case of a tyrant or an oppressive ruler, the two choices presented are: 1, staying patient under the rule of the tyrant, or 2, revolting and overthrowing the ruler. The reason that revolting can be considered an evil is because of the harm that it causes to innocent people. In the case of the rebellion against Yazid, a civil war broke out that took the lives of thousands of people, and many more were injured or violated or had their lives and their properties destroyed. It was a time of great difficulty for all of the people in the Muslim world, whether they participated voluntarily or not. If this world were to be destroyed, that would be less significance before Allah than the unlawful killing of a single believer. When a tyrant begins to feel his position is being threatened, he will do whatever is in his power to maintain his position. This includes killing and torturing and massacring the people, and his army will be given amnesty for whatever crimes they commit. Very rarely does a revolt actually succeed, and even more rarely does it bring about a better situation for the people. Because of this, staying patient with a tyrant is the better of the two evils, and allowing him to maintain his position will prevent the population from experiencing a greater suffering. The only exception to this is if the tyrant is a clear kafir and someone who is preventing the Muslims from practicing the religion. And in this case, a rebellion can only take place if the Muslims have the military power to do so. A kafir is someone who purposely tries to conceal or destroy or fight against Islam. It's not the same as a non-Muslim who simply doesn't know much or hasn't done research into the religion. The Prophet ﷺ called us and we gave him the pledge of allegiance for Islam. And among the conditions on which he took the pledge from us was that we were to listen and obey the orders, both at the time when we were active and at the time when we were tired, and at our difficult time and at our ease, and to be obedient to the ruler and to give him his right, even if he did not give us our right, and not to fight against him unless we noticed him having open kufr, from which we would have a proof with us from Allah. The best of your rulers are those whom you love and who love you, who invoke God's blessing upon you, and you invoke His blessing upon them. And the worst of your rulers are those whom you hate and who hate you, and whom you curse and who curse you. It was asked by those present, shouldn't we overthrow them with the help of the sword? The Prophet ﷺ said, no, as long as they establish prayer among you. If then you find anything detestable in them, you should hate their administration, but do not withdraw yourselves from their obedience. But that then brings up the question of how someone becomes a ruler in the first place. How is it that a tyrant can come into power over the Muslims? And is a tyrannical ruler even legitimate in the first place? There are two main ways in which a ruler can come into power. One is by electing a new leader by choice, and two is by him taking power by force. In either case, someone comes and establishes rule over a nation, but each method has its own nuance and rulings, with one method being obviously more preferable to the other. When a Khalifa or ruler dies, there are various ways in which the next leader can be chosen. One way is that the last Khalifa can choose who is the next Khalifa, such as in the case of Abu Bakr choosing Omar. Another option is for a council of advisors to choose the next leader, such as in the case of Omar selecting a council of 6 people who would ultimately choose Uthman. In the case of the Prophet ﷺ, he gave hints to the people as to who should be chosen next, but ultimately the people were left to make the decision. However, this does not mean that every person's vote needs to be counted for the election. Rather, the scholars and the judges and the people of wisdom can come to the decision, and it would be enough for the rest of the society to accept that decision. These people are generally known as Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd, those who loosen and bind. This means the people with the recognized social clout to contract and, if necessary, dissolve the political authority of the ruler. They are usually the scholars and the judges and the tribal leaders of the nation, and they need to be known for their justice and their sound judgment and their influence over the people in order to be recognized as part of this group. But their choice has limitations, as there are criteria for someone to be elected as leader. One is the baseline legal capacity. He has to be a sane, adult, free Muslim. Two is that he has to be upright and just. No open disobedience to Allah. Three, he has to have the ability to govern. Can he protect life? Can he protect property, secure borders, run courts, finance, and enforce law? Four, he has to have religious and political knowledge. He has to have enough knowledge to make religious and political judgments, to decide major matters, or at least at a minimum to choose and supervise qualified scholars and judges. Fifth, he has to have sound senses and limbs. No impairments that prevents him from governing, such as issues with hearing or sight or speech or mobility. And sixth, he has to have courage and sound policy. He has to be able to resolve wars or crises with wisdom and good administration. In the case of Muawiyah choosing his son Yazid to become the next Khalifa, the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd in Medina were split in their decision, with some people approving him while others rejected. Hussein and Abdullah bin Zubayr were clearly part of this group, but when they disapproved of Yazid, they were eventually threatened and forced to seek shelter in Mecca. And that brings up the issue of a ruler forcing himself into the seat of power. How exactly does that work? And does he become a legitimate king? Taking power by force is not always an illegitimate action. In the case of Ali ibn Abi Talib, for example, he set out to confront Muawiyah and take control of Syria by force. If he had succeeded, Ali would have been recognized as the legitimate Khalifa in those lands as well. But even in the case that a leader revolted and came to power through illegitimate means, once he attained clear control over the land, he had now become a legitimate ruler. But that doesn't excuse him from the sins he has committed in the eyes of Allah. And if he is not forgiven for his crimes, then Allah may punish him in the end. There is none whom Allah puts in authority over people, and he dies while deceiving them, except that paradise is forbidden to him. But just because a leader commits a sin, it doesn't make him a kafir. And as long as he is a Muslim, he can continue to rule over the Muslim lands. But this is one of the issues that the Khawarij outright reject. They claim that all sins make someone a kafir, therefore, according to them, if a leader commits one sin, he can be overthrown and executed. This is why the Khawarij were willing to turn against even Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, and a man who had been promised Jannah many times, even while he was still living. They considered his compromise with Muawiyah to be a form of a sin, and they were willing to kill him for it, claiming that he was a kafir. This is why the Prophet ﷺ called them the worst of creatures in creation, and that they would leave Islam like an arrow passes through its prey. But what about Hussein and Abdullah ibn Zubayr? Were their actions considered rebellion, or were they right in rejecting Yazid? When Hussein and Abdullah ibn Zubayr rejected Yazid's legitimacy as the ruler of the caliphate, what they did was not necessarily bad, but it was the lesser of two good options. Yazid's caliphate had not yet been fully established, and both Hussein and Abdullah ibn Zubayr were considered part of the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd, who were responsible for choosing the new ruler. Neither of them ever agreed to giving their pledge of allegiance to Yazid, and so when they rejected him and fled to Mecca, it wasn't considered a rebellion. Then Hussein heard from the people of Kufa that they had rejected Yazid and broken their contract with him. This was a rebellion and a sin for the people of Kufa, but it was not a sin for Hussein, as he had given no oath. Hussein then traveled to Kufa, unarmed, without any army. He was only with his family and his close friends, and when the army of Yazid eventually stopped him, Hussein said that Yazid had established himself with military power in the land. And so he agreed to give Yazid his pledge of allegiance, knowing that it was better to submit to a tyrant rather than to cause divisions and bloodshed among the Muslims. Of course, this didn't stop the army from killing him in the end, whether it was Yazid or the governor of Kufa or the Kufans themselves who were ultimately responsible for his killing. Allah knows best how they will be judged. But what is clear is that his killing had such great repercussions over the next 1400 years. And after his death, many rebel groups came in successive waves, each claiming that they wanted vengeance for his killing. Even today, the Muslim world is split, with the death of Hussein remaining as relative as ever. And many groups still kill innocent Muslims, claiming that they are doing so in the name of Hussein. The same can be said about Abdullah ibn Zubayr, even though he clearly called himself a Khalifa while Yazid was still alive. In his opinion, Yazid still hadn't established rule in the land, and so he took the opportunity to gather the people around him and challenge him before he had fully secured the throne. But in the end, Yazid's army proved too powerful, and he came to Medina and massacred the people. Then he went to Mecca and began a siege of the city. But when he died and the siege failed, all of a sudden, Abdullah ibn Zubayr became the rightful Khalifa. Soon after, Abdullah ibn Zubayr began sending out emissaries to all the different provinces, and before long, the leaders of all the major cities had sworn their allegiance to him. But when Marwan ibn al-Hakim sent an army against him, he became the more rebellious side, while Abdullah ibn Zubayr was in the right. In the end, the best decision was that of Abdullah ibn Omar, who decided to give Yazid his pledge of allegiance in the beginning and to be patient with the tyrant. In his opinion, Yazid had the greatest military might in the Muslim world, and if anyone were to stand against him, they would be killed and potentially split the ummah into pieces. And his predictions clearly came true. I have seen something astonishing in the palace, meaning the governor's palace in Kufa. I saw the head of Hussein set before Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Then I saw the head of Ibn Ziyad set before Mukhtar. Then I saw the head of Mukhtar set before Mus'ab ibn Zubayr, who was the brother of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Then I saw the head of Mus'ab ibn Zubayr set before al-Malik ibn Marwan. May Allah forgive Hussein, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and Abdullah ibn Umar, for they were all righteous men. But if rebellion against a tyrant is impermissible and only leads to the death and destruction of Muslims, then what actions can we take to better our situation and free ourselves from tyranny? The contract between the ruler and the population is a two-way relationship. Each side needs to support the other in order for justice, peace, and prosperity to be achieved in society. From a practical perspective, how is it that a ruler can administer and maintain stability in his nation if his people won't obey his laws? For example, if the ruler puts lanes and signs and traffic lights in the streets, but the people ignore these and choose to drive recklessly on the road, will the ruler be able to lower the rate of car accidents? A man came to Ali ibn Abi Talib while he was the Khalifa, and he asked him, "O commander of the believers, how is it that the people complied with Abu Bakr and Omar when the world was so tight for them, and then under them it expanded? But when you and Uthman held the caliphate, the people didn't listen to you. They didn't comply with you both. And although the world had already expanded, it became tighter than that of a handspan." Ali then replied, "Because the people of Abu Bakr and Omar were like me and Uthman, while my people today are like you and you're like." Likewise, if the people are honest in their businesses when the ruler overburdens the people with taxes and manipulates the currency, will the nation ever be prosperous? Allah upholds the just state, even if it is led by non-believers. And He does not uphold the unjust state, even if it is led by Muslims. It is also said the world endures with justice and disbelief, but it will not endure with injustice and Islam together. But even if this is the case, that both the ruler and the population are honest and just, it doesn't necessarily mean that the nation will be prosperous. There are so many other factors involved in prosperity that are out of the people's control. How can a nation grow wealthy if it has no natural resources to exploit? How can a nation conduct trade if it has no seas or rivers to sail its cargo ships on? How can a nation defend its borders if it has no mountains or deserts or natural protection? How can a nation build industries if it has no large population to rely on for labor? Rather, prosperity and wealth and peace, these are all issues of rizq, provisions from Allah that He provides to a people. And Allah knows best what rizq to give to each nation and how much to give.
ولو بسط الله الرزق لعباده لبغوا في الأرض ولكن ينزل بقدر ما يشاء إنه بعباده خبير بصير.
As for the people who find themselves under the rule of oppression,
إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم وإذا أراد الله بقوم سوءا فلا مرد له وما لهم من دونه من وال.
Perhaps this is a test for the people and a way to bring them back into the fold of Islam. For during times of prosperity, the people become arrogant and stop worshipping Allah. But during times of suffering and difficulty, the people humble themselves and return to Allah. And only then are they given the keys to Jannah. May Allah make us a people who are prosperous in this life and in the next. Ameen.
The rectangular Kaaba.
When Hajjaj ibn Yusuf led the Umayyad army into the city of Mecca, they found the Kaaba had been transformed from a square into a rectangle. Shocked by this, he sent a message to the new Khalifa, al-Malik ibn Marwan, telling him of the bizarre changes that Abdullah ibn Zubayr had made to the Kaaba while he was in control of the Haram. He had extended the Kaaba's walls on one side, building them over where the Hijr of Ismail is today. He then put an entrance on the ground level and added a second door to the opposite side of the building, making one for entering and the other for exiting. These changes had all been made after Yazid launched the first siege of Mecca. That's when the Kaaba caught fire and Abdullah ibn Zubayr took the opportunity to make those changes that the Prophet ﷺ had always wished for. The Prophet ﷺ asked his wife Aisha, "Don't you see that when your people built the Kaaba, they did not build it on all of the foundations built by Ibrahim alayhi salam?" She said, "O Allah's Messenger, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, why don't we build it on the foundations of Ibrahim?" The Prophet ﷺ said, "But for the fact that your people have recently given up paganism, I would have done so." In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, "I would have made two doors on the level on the ground, facing the east and the west." Do you know why your people raised the level of the door? Aisha said, "No." The Prophet ﷺ said, "They did it out of vanity, so that they may be in a position to grant admittance to only those people that they wished. When a person intended to get into it, they let him climb the stairs. And as he was about to enter, they pushed him off, and he fell." The Quraysh were recent converts to Islam, and making such a huge change would have severely shaken their iman. So the Prophet ﷺ kept the Kaaba as it was, while Abdullah ibn Zubayr fulfilled his dream. However, al-Malik did not know this. In fact, when he heard about the changes that he had made, he was shocked. May Allah ruin Ibn Zubayr that he lies about the Kaaba. So he ordered Hajjaj to tear down the changes that Abdullah ibn Zubayr had made and restore the old square shape and the Hijr of Ismail and the raised door. Later, when he visited the Kaaba in Mecca, the people confirmed that the changes Abdullah ibn Zubayr had made were in line with what Aisha had described. Hearing this, he regretted reverting the Kaaba back to its old shape. And ever since then, the Kaaba has remained a square with the Hijr of Ismail, marking the missing piece of the Kaaba. I wish I had left Ibn Zubayr's work there. There is a benefit in keeping the shape, however. Even when the door to the Kaaba is closed, a person can pray in the Hijr of Ismail and they would get the reward of being inside the Kaaba. Because after all, that is part of the foundations that Ibrahim made.
Hajjaj ibn Yusuf in Iraq.
With Hajjaj ibn Yusuf having now conquered Mecca, he was now seen as a capable leader, though ruthless in his tactics. This made him the perfect candidate to govern the province of Iraq. It was the most unstable of all the Muslim provinces, with a people that refused to submit. Hajjaj now traveled to Iraq and entered the great masjid of Kufa, and there he began his inaugural speech, much to the shock of the people who lived there. "O people of Kufa, I see heads that have ripened, and the time has come to harvest them, and I am the man to do it, by God. I can almost see the blood glistening between the turbans and the beards. By God, the commander of the believers, al-Malik, emptied out his quiver and felt each arrow one by one, and he found me the hardest shaft, and so he aimed me at you and loosened me upon you." It was said that the people of Kufa used to throw pebbles at the new governors whenever they heard something they didn't like. But Hajjaj was so imposing and his speech was so shocking that you could hear the pebbles hit the ground as they fell from people's hands. Throughout the Umayyad dynasty and even during the Caliphate of Ali, most of the rebellions originated from the provinces of Iraq, and it seemed like no governor was able to control it. But Hajjaj was now coming to the people and announcing that no dissension would be tolerated. He was willing to kill anyone who even hinted at rebellion in order to maintain absolute stability in the region. And he was true to his word in that he would kill many, many people as he would be tested by rebellion after rebellion. Ever since Hussein had been killed, Iraq erupted in wave after wave of rebellions, each more vicious than the last. It was almost as if this land had been a curse for the Umayyads, and the uprisings would not stop until their kingdom was eventually toppled. The next of these revolts was called the Shababiyya, led by Shabib al-Shaybani and his wife Ghazala. Not much is known about the two, though they may have originally been part of the Khawarij. But what is known is how fiercely they fought, and that Ghazala once managed to briefly take control of Kufa. Legend has it that Hajjaj fled to his palace in Basra, afraid to fight her. She then went to the main masjid and recited 2 of the longest surahs in a single prayer, a show of dominance over Hajjaj that even in prayer she wouldn't be touched. A lion against me, but in battle an ostrich, broad-rumped, bolting at the whistle of a whistler. Why didn't you come out to face Ghazala in the fray? No, your heart has flown away on a bird's wings. These two were a very strange couple that didn't really seem to want power. All they would do is go up and down the province, raiding and killing whoever was ruling and causing havoc among the people. Several times Hajjaj sent his armies to go after them, but each time they just narrowly escaped his wrath. But eventually the forces were subdued and Ghazala was killed in battle. Shabib's horse then tripped on a bridge and he was thrown into a river. And they say that he didn't even try to resist, only giving in to the current while saying that this is Allah's will. He then drowned in the water, disappearing as quickly as he came, and one can only speculate what he wanted out of terrorizing the Umayyads. The next revolution would be known as the Peacock Army. But what made this one different was that it came from Hajjaj's own soldiers who now revolted against him. Their leader was Abdurrahman ibn al-Ash'ath, one of Hajjaj's greatest commanders. He had even been one of those who had been sent to capture Shabib, and now he took his place as the main threat to the Umayyad power. They were known as the Peacock Army because it was packed with aristocrats and notables from Basra and Kufa, and they were equipped with the best horses and the best armor. It seems that there had been a personal struggle between Abdurrahman and Hajjaj. And when Abdurrahman announced to his army that he was going to mutiny against the governor, his soldiers followed him as they were loyal to him, and they gave him their oaths of allegiance. Quickly, he allied himself with the king of Zabulistan, a land on the edges of the Umayyad Caliphate. He then turned around and conquered Kufa and Basra and the surrounding region. And there he was welcomed by the people who had suffered under the tyranny of Hajjaj. al-Malik, the Umayyad Khalifa, then sent Abdurrahman a proposal. He offered to sack Hajjaj and share control over Iraq with him. But Abdurrahman now felt confident that he could take Damascus too. And if Damascus fell, then so would the rest of the Umayyad Empire. Hajjaj knew that al-Malik had thrown him under the bus, but he remained loyal to him and continued serving him as his commander. He then fought a fierce battle against Abdurrahman and his rebels, but eventually Hajjaj overcame them and came out victorious. This rebellion was such a close call, and it was the closest the Umayyads had ever come to completely losing power. It was said that Hajjaj even prayed the 2 rak'at of shukr, a prayer thanking Allah for not letting them succeed. Hajjaj even went on to pray for mercy for his past enemy, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, as his enmity had been so soft in comparison to Abdurrahman. Soon after the battle, al-Malik and Hajjaj decided to make a new capital city in Iraq. It was known as Wasit, and it would sit between Basra and Kufa. And there they would house the armies of Syria and not have them mix in with the locals. And their spies would be headquartered there to intercept all communications from the locals. Never did they want to see another rebellion rise up from Basra and Kufa, and especially not from their own Syrian people who were stationed there in the region. One of the reasons why Abdurrahman ibn al-Ash'ath had gained such a following in Iraq was that many of the scholars of that region explicitly supported him. They believed that Hajjaj ibn Yusuf was a munafiq, that he had left the fold of Islam, and in doing so he had lost the legitimate authority, and so a rebellion could be launched against him. For example, in one of his speeches, Hajjaj said the following line: "O people, whoever is exhausted by his illness, I have his cure. And whoever's life is prolonged, it is my duty to hasten his death. Whoever is not satisfied with wellness, destruction will not be too difficult for him." Here it seems as if he's claiming control over lifespans, something that belongs only to Allah, clearly overstepping his boundaries. In another instance, he claimed that Hussein was not really the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, as matrilineal relationships don't count. To that came the reply, "You, Hajjaj, have lied. Allah said that among his descendants are Dawood and Isa. Isa is a descendant of Ibrahim through his mother's side, and Hussein is the son of the daughter of the Messenger of Allah." These are only a few fragments of Hajjaj's speeches that have been recorded in the history books, and perhaps there were many more such claims he had made that were known to the people at the time. That's why some of the scholars called him a kafir, supporting rebellion against him. The most famous of these was Sa'd ibn Jubayr, who was later imprisoned and executed by Hajjaj after the fall of the Peacock Army. There's a famous dialogue between him and Hajjaj when he was finally caught. Hajjaj said, "What is your name?" So Sa'd said, "Sa'd ibn Jubayr." Hajjaj said, "No, it is Shaqi ibn Qusayr." This was a pun. Sa'd means happy and Shaqi means wretched. Jubayr means bone setter, while Qusayr means breaker. Sa'd then replied, "My mother knew my name bad." Hajjaj then replied saying, "I will replace your rule with fire." Sa'd then said, "If you could, I'd take you as a god." Sa'd was implying that only Allah could take someone to the hellfire. Sa'd then faced the Qibla to pray 2 rak'at. This was, of course, the sunnah before execution. Hajjaj then told his soldiers, "Turn him away from the Qibla." And so Sa'd recited the following:
ولله المشرق والمغرب فأينما تولوا فثم وجه الله.
Hajjaj then said to his soldiers, "Put his face on the ground." And so Sa'd recited the following:
منها خلقناكم وفيها نعيدكم ومنها نخرجكم تارة أخرى.
Hajjaj then replied, "I'll kill you with a killing I've used on no one." And Sa'd said, "Choose what you wish. God will repay you in kind." Sa'd ibn Jubayr was then executed, and many reports say that just before he died, he made a dua that Allah not give Hajjaj power over anyone after him. Hajjaj died a few months later.
The Red Pill Ideology of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf.
Before al-Malik passed away, he left a letter for his sons, telling them to keep Hajjaj close by as he was indispensable for their reign. But when his eldest son Walid became the next Khalifa, his own wife began advising him to sack Hajjaj because of his cruelty to the people. One day Hajjaj was sitting in the court of Walid discussing matters of the state, and because he had just come back from a war, he was still dressed in his armor and carrying a spear. When Walid's wife heard about his visit, she sent a servant to send Walid a message. The servant then came to Walid and whispered in his ear, interrupting the conversation between the two men. Walid said, "My wife has just sent me a message saying that she prefers that I sit with the angel of death rather than you for the number of lives you have taken." Hajjaj ibn Yusuf then replied, "O commander of the believers, don't be worn down by the nagging of women, for women are merely delicate flowers and not the managers of affairs. Don't ask them for their advice. Don't reveal your secrets to them, and don't use them for anything except for their beauty. Don't be overly gentle with them, and don't spend too much time in their company, for spending too much time with them is a sign of humiliation and degeneracy." At that, Hajjaj stood up and left. Walid was somewhat amused by this, and he told his wife what Hajjaj has said. In response, his wife requested that he order Hajjaj to meet her in the courtroom tomorrow. And when Walid commanded him to do so, he appeared, though somewhat shocked and frightened. But obedient as he was to his Khalifa, he waited for her in the palace. Hours went by and Hajjaj was forced to stand there, waiting in humiliation. But eventually Walid's wife arrived and she refused to let him speak. She then said, "O Hajjaj, you boast of doing the Khalifa a favor by killing Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Abdurrahman ibn al-Ash'ath. Remember, you were once a lowly servant, not a master. And wallahi, had you not been the least of Allah's creatures in His sight, He would not have tested you with your stoning of the Kaaba, nor with your killing of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the son of the one of the two belts. She was saying that Hajjaj was the worst of Allah's creation, which is why he was the one chosen to pelt the Kaaba with stones and kill Abdullah ibn Zubayr. She was also honoring Abdullah ibn Zubayr's mother, Asma bint Abi Bakr, as she was the one given the nickname, the one of the two belts. This is because when the Prophet ﷺ fled from Mecca with her father Abu Bakr to make hijrah to Medina, she tore her belt into two pieces and used both of them to tie their food and water supplies. As for Abdurrahman ibn al-Ash'ath and his peacock army, yes, he grew powerful and beat you back again and again until you were crying for help. Had the Khalifa not summoned the Syrians, and had their spears not overshadowed you and their hands not saved you in close combat, your noose would have been tightened. You were finished. Know too that the Khalifa's wives shook their perfume from their braids and the jewels from their hands and feet and sent them off as gifts to the Khalifa's supporters. She was saying here that the Khalifa's women gave all they had to support the state. They didn't weaken it. As for your telling the Khalifa to cut off his pleasures and to keep away from his wives, if his women open themselves for a man like the Khalifa, he will be too distracted to listen to you. And if they open themselves like your mother did, then perhaps he should follow your advice. She was saying here that the wives of the Khalifa were so beautiful that he wouldn't be able to resist them if they tempted him. But if someone like Hajjaj's mother were to try to tempt the Khalifa, then he should listen to Hajjaj's advice and stay away from such women. Clearly, she was insulting his mother. A lion against me, but in battle an ostrich broad-rumped, bolting at the whistle of a whistler. Why didn't you come out to face Ghazala in the fray? Though your heart had flown away from the bird's wings. This was the poem mocking Hajjaj that had become famous after a woman, Ghazala, struck fear into his heart and made him flee to hide in the palace of Basra. At that she ordered Hajjaj to leave without even giving him a chance to speak. Hajjaj later admitted to Walid that she didn't stop until I wished that the earth would swallow me. I never imagined a woman could reach her eloquence. That woman was al-Banin, the sister of Omar ibn al-Aziz. Both of them hated Hajjaj for his oppression of the people of Iraq. At the time, Omar ibn al-Aziz was the governor of Medina, and he would constantly write to Walid advocating for the people of Iraq and advising him to sack Hajjaj. But Walid kept to the advice of his father and kept Hajjaj, sacking Omar ibn al-Aziz instead. But eventually, of course, we'll get to his story as well. al-Banin was a scholar and a princess, and clearly a woman of eloquence, strength, and integrity. Yet she was not rebellious nor disobedient to her husband. Rather, she respected him and gave advice to him, and in the end accepted his authority and followed his decisions. Even in confronting Hajjaj, she made a request to her husband first. She didn't need to shout or become irate in his presence. Rather, she presented herself with strength and dignity, reserved in her speech, and she ultimately humiliated Hajjaj. The strength of a woman truly is not like the strength of a man. This is the true sign of a strong and mature woman. She did not seek independence from her husband or from her family, rather she supported them in whatever way she could, comforting them when they are beaten, nursing them back to health when they are sick, and being a person who brings light to the life of others and brings joy to the people around them. But Hajjaj and the modern red pill community don't understand this, as they reduce the merit of women to the mere sexual market value. This was what Hajjaj meant when he said that women were only good for their beauty and that it was humiliating to spend time with them. But in that thinking, he had truly deprived himself of the greatest virtues of women.
The legacy of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf.
My Lord, the enemies have sworn and strained themselves to say that I'm a man destined for the hellfire. O Allah, forgive me, because the people say that you will not. The legacy of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf is a rather complicated one, with people both praising him and reviling him for what he did as governor of Iraq. On one side, he was a violent and brutal dictator that may have executed tens of thousands of people during his reign. He violated the sanctity of the Haram when he defeated Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and he spoke lines of borderline kufr, bringing many people at his time to declare him a kafir. And yet, what he accomplished in his term as governor was nothing short of extraordinary. He brought stability to the region when no other governor could, and he even put down rebellions that would have otherwise toppled the ruling government and potentially brought another 20 years of anarchy and civil war to the Muslims. Under the Khalifa al-Malik ibn Marwan, he implemented sweeping reforms to the economy and to the state that completely revolutionized the caliphate. And he organized and managed new expansions into Central Asia and Sind. As for his Islam, he was a man who had an extreme love for the Quran. No doubt he was a multimillionaire who could have lived an extremely luxurious life, but instead of spending it on himself, he spent all of his wealth giving to Quran teachers and reciters and funding organizations that would propagate its recitation. He died with only 300 dirhams, around $1,300 to his name. In his youth, he had earned his living by being a Quran teacher, and in his old age, he continued to recite a quarter of the Quran each night. And he is often credited with introducing the dots on the Arabic letters to help distinguish between them. But perhaps the most interesting take on Hajjaj's legacy came from a future Khalifa of the Umayyad dynasty. Never have I envied the enemy of Allah, al-Hajjaj, for anything except for his love of the Quran, his giving to its people, and for his saying at death, "O Allah, forgive me, for people claim you will not."
Every 10 years or so, a new ideology comes to attack Islam, whether it's liberalism or feminism or capitalism, communism, consumerism, scientism, secularism, individualism, or even, of course, the promotion of sexual perversions with ideologies such as the LGBT movement. And so in this book I'm writing called The Entire History of Islam, I have a chapter dedicated to the colonization of the Muslim world by Western powers. But it wasn't just the physical colonization through military might or the enslavement to the banks through debt traps, but there was also a colonization of the mind of the Muslims through the use of all of these ideologies that take our children away from Islam. So in this book, I will explain how each of these ideologies came about, and I will respond to each of them with the Islamic stance on them and how Islam differs in its lifestyle. So for example, when I'm talking about capitalism and communism, I have a whole explanation on how the Islamic economy works. Or when I'm talking about feminism, I give an explanation of the roles of men and women according to Islam and how authority within the marriage contract works. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And if you pre-order, I will literally write your name into this book, an honor for you, because you are one of the very first people to support this project. Something special for the people who pre-ordered this book.
The Umayyads are often vilified for the many fitnas that they caused, yet it was because of them that the Arabs reached a high level of civilization, competing even with the Romans and the Persians. And that's because not every Umayyad ruler was like Yazid. We have now passed the second fitna in our series on the Umayyads, and we will be entering the golden age, one that most people have forgotten. In this video, we'll see exactly what the great achievements in the Umayyad Caliphate were, as well as the famous and yet relatively unknown life of Omar ibn al-Aziz, and with his death comes a great mystery. Was his death really natural, or is there something a little bit more nefarious at play?
Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan and his son Walid I, architects of an empire.
With the rebellions of Iraq having been put down by Hajjaj, the government in Damascus could now administer the provinces effectively. And soon they would bring a number of reforms and regulations, changing the way the Muslims had ruled themselves, bringing forth a higher culture and civilization. These projects were started by Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, who ruled for 20 years, and many of them would then be continued by his son Walid, who ruled for another 10 years after him. When the Muslims conquered the Roman and Persian empires, they took over the old administrations and integrated them into the new Muslim state. But these new Arab rulers found that they couldn't read or understand their written records, as the old Roman institutions wrote all their records in Greek or Coptic, while the Persians wrote their records in the Persian language. So Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan decided to convert all administrative works into Arabic, unifying the provinces under a single administrative language. It was one of the most ambitious projects that the Muslims had ever undertaken, one that would take over a decade to to complete. Arabization was not just a translation of old records. It required changing fiscal forms and numerals and coin legends and seals and filing practices and training staff in technical Arabic. Thousands of people had to work on this project, and an immense amount of resources had to be spent in order to complete it. But even when it was finished, the local administrators still had to get used to the new system. So realistically, it may have taken up to 30 years for the transformation to be fully achieved. But one misconception that many people have is that the Umayyads were trying to erase the local cultures and colonize the people. However, Arabization of these lands was strictly administrative, and it only affected the people closest to the government. The average person in Egypt or Syria or Persia or any other province did not have to learn Arabic, nor were they even encouraged to. Rather, the Umayyads were Arab supremacists who preferred that the other provinces did not adopt their customs and traditions. This was one of the major flaws of the Umayyads, but we'll talk a little bit more on that when we come to the Mawali system. Despite this, the Arabization project was one of the greatest decisions that the Umayyads had ever made, as not only did it unify all of the provinces, but also brought the Arabic language to a higher level of civilization. Up until this point, Arabic had always been used as a mainly oral language. But with the state administration now using it in their official writings, Arabic was elevated to a literary language. This also removed the perception that Arabs were barbarians, and for the first time in history, they began exporting their culture to the rest of the world. Soon, Arabic would become the lingua franca among the scholars and the administrators, the aristocrats and the businessmen, and with their power and influence, Arabic was eventually adopted by the people in the Levant and Egypt and the rest of North Africa. When the Mongols conquered the vast lands of Asia, they created the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. But because they didn't have a literary language, they couldn't export their culture or their civilization. And so the perception remains that they were uncivilized barbarians. Today, very little remnants of their great empire remain in the modern world. And despite being so much larger than the Umayyad Caliphate, the Mongols will never be considered one of the great civilizations of history. The Persians, however, would always maintain their language, despite the fact that they would learn Arabic to participate in Islamic scholarship. And how strange it was that the majority of great Islamic scholarship would eventually come from the Persians themselves, while at the same time the Persian language would eventually also have a resurgence, later becoming its own lingua franca in the eastern lands of the Caliphate. Another major project started by the Umayyads was the development of a new currency controlled by the Muslim Caliphate. The project initially began under Muawiyah when he took the coins of the Romans and printed Arabic inscriptions on them. This was an attempt to maintain commerce with an already trusted currency, but he made minor changes to show that there was a new authority in town. However, one major issue with these coins was that they kept the Roman icons and symbols. Many coins had images of crosses and the faces of Roman emperors, signs that were unbefitting of the Muslims and that went against the religion they were preaching. So when al-Malik ibn Marwan took control of the caliphate, he revolutionized Muawiyah's project by creating a new set of coins. At first, these coins replaced the Roman emperors with images of the Khalifa himself. However, after scholars decided that this was not permissible, they were then replaced by text-only designs, including Quranic ayat and, of course, the Shahada. These coins were then introduced to all the various provinces, integrating taxes and army pay and audits all into one seamless system. They soon became a symbol of strength of the caliphate, giving confidence in the market while promoting a strong, independent Islamic identity separate from any other empire. At the time, there was no internet, no phone lines, nor any forms of electronic communication. Sending a message from one end of the empire to another could take weeks or even months depending on the distance. So Muawiyah began a project to reduce these shipping times, and al-Malik eventually finished it. This project soon became the core communication line between the Umayyad leadership in Damascus and the other provinces of the caliphate. The idea was to build a network of relay stations between each of the provinces and regions. Each station would have full-time horsemen whose only job was to travel from one station to another, never straying from their specific route. Horsemen would take a message from one station and bring it to the next, passing on various letters like a baton is passed between runners in an Olympic race. Previously, for a message message to get from Damascus to Medina, it would have taken anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. But now with this courier system, the travel time was significantly reduced and a message could arrive in as little as 8 days. All of this meant that the central government in Damascus now had the ability to oversee the far-off provinces of the caliphate, addressing their specific needs and managing them in whatever issues they had. And through this messaging system, an internal intelligence grid could be formed, turning the largest empire the world had ever seen up until that point into a fully governable state. Another facet of the Umayyad governance was their love for sophisticated and monumental buildings. During their dynasty, they created a unique architectural style, taking influence from the Romans and from the Persians, but adding their own elements and styles while removing the iconography of the other religions. In their buildings, they would create large axial spaces that would give its visitors a dramatic walk from the entrance into the main areas of the building. The walls were often decorated with highly detailed mosaics and patterns, specifically avoiding the appearance of any living creatures. Long Quranic inscriptions were carved into the walls, replacing the icons of the Romans and the Persians. Then there were the large courtyards outside that added the grandeur of these constructions. The masjids in particular were also given mihrabs with mimbars beside them to show the direction of the Qibla. Square minarets were then erected in the corners of the buildings, influenced by the designs of old Arabian towers. But perhaps the most iconic feature of Umayyad architecture were the grand domes that shielded the roofs of their buildings, protruding from the top and covered in mosaics on the inside. These domes were often coated in thin layers of fresh copper or bronze or even gold leaf, acting as lanterns that reflected the sunlight during the day and moonlight during the night. Perhaps the most famous example of Umayyad architecture is the Dome of the Rock that sits in the center of Al-Aqsa Masjid on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This was built by al-Malik ibn Marwan in the exact place where Sulaiman alayhi salam had built his temple so long ago. Until now, its golden dome remains a visual symbol of Jerusalem that's recognized by people all over the world, and the building itself has become a symbol of the return of Islam to the region after the Romans had destroyed the Temple of Solomon and used it as a garbage dump. There's a common misconception that the Dome of the Rock is Al-Aqsa Masjid. However, this is not entirely correct. Al-Aqsa Masjid is the entire complex, also known as the Temple Mount, while the Dome of the Rock is a shrine that sits in the middle of it. There's also a building that's used for prayer called Masjid al-Qibli towards the south, though this is often also mistakenly called Masjid al-Aqsa as well. Furthermore, the Temple of Solomon was a name for the Masjid of Sulaiman. Masjid al-Aqsa is just the modern Arabic name for it. Finally, there is the great Umayyad Masjid of Damascus, the masterpiece of the Umayyad dynasty. This project was started during the rule of Walid, though it required permission from the Christian community first. You see, when Khalid ibn Walid began his conquest of Damascus, he surrounded the city and put the entire city under siege. Each gate of the walled city was then blocked by a different commander, who made sure that all supplies to the city were cut off. But one night, Khalid ibn al-Walid managed to climb over the walls of the city and open his gate for the rest of the army. But this happened in the dark, and the other Muslim commanders were unaware that he had breached the city. So when the leader of Damascus realized that the other Muslims weren't attacking, he quickly went to them and negotiated a surrender of the city. This meant that technically the city fell to a peace agreement, even though the Muslims were already in the middle of conquering the city. According to the ancient rules of war, if a city surrendered, it could be allowed to keep its property and simply pay a regular tribute or tax to the victor. If the city was taken by force, however, the victor wasn't bound to any peace treaty and could take all of the property in the city for himself. When Khalid found out what had happened, he argued that the city had already fallen to his soldiers. But the other Muslim commanders emphasized that a treaty had already been signed, and so they were bound to abide by it and let the people of Damascus keep their property. In the end, a compromise was reached, and all of the war booty that Khalid's men had taken would have to be returned to the people. However, within the peace treaty, the Muslims negotiated to use half of the prayer space of the main church of Damascus. And so for more than 70 years, this compromise remained. The Muslims and the Christians would use the same building for worship, with the adhan being called from the same place where the church bells would ring. But eventually, when Walid became the Khalifa, he negotiated with the Christians to purchase the entire building, offering them a large pile of gold and an equivalent church just like it. He also promised to return any other churches or properties in the city that would have been taken from them by previous governors. And in the end, the Christians agreed So the Muslims took the whole building. According to legend, the Christians warned Walid about a curse that had been put on the building. If anyone were to damage or destroy it, they would lose their minds and be driven insane. But in order to build the new masjid, the main building of the church would have to be demolished, thus invoking the curse that they warned about. So Walid climbed up the building, reaching the highest peak above the clock tower and bells. And there stood a shaheed, the witness, a statue of Christ hung on the cross, revered by the people, much like the famous Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro. Walid then took a golden axe and swung it at the statue, shouting, "Allahu Akbar," as he did. But as the priests and the bishops waited below, anticipating the curse, nothing happened to Walid. So he swung again, and nothing happened each time. And in the end, the Christian idol was torn down from its place. At that, reconstruction of the church began, and all other icons and idols were removed from the building. It's said that 12,000 artisans and craftsmen were brought in from all over the world, and up to 1 million golden dinars, or over 555 million US dollars today, was spent on its construction. It took some 10 years to build and nearly the entire length of Walid's reign as Khalifa, and it was only finished in the year he died, perhaps just before he even got to see its completion. Today, it still stands in Damascus, though somewhat damaged by the recent civil war, and you can see the many signs of its history as a building that was once shared by both the Muslims and the Christians, in which both groups congregated and worshipped. Today, for example, there's a small domed shrine inside the main prayer hall of the masjid. Legend has it that in it lies the head of Yahya alayhi salam that was kept there by the Christians. It's one of the many remnants of the Christian history in the Umayyad masjid. Many believe that this is the masjid where Isa alayhi salam will descend to upon his second coming and perform his prayers in it, though Allah knows best. During this period of great stability and state building, the Umayyads also began to expand the Muslim empire into new lands, completing the conquests from Morocco in the west to Sind in the east, continuing off from where Muawiyah had left. During the reign of Muawiyah, the Muslim commander Uqba ibn Nafi' and eventually led an expedition all the way to the ends of Morocco, where he reached the Atlantic Ocean. There, standing on the shores of the Atlantic, looking beyond the horizon, he is said to have spoken those legendary words, "O Allah, if the sea had not prevented me, I would have galloped on forever like Alexander the Great, upholding your faith and fighting the unbelievers." But as he was returning back to his newly built base of Karawain in Tunisia, he was ambushed by one of the local Amazigh kings and killed in battle. These local Amazigh tribes had been conquered by the Romans hundreds of years before, and over time, many of them developed alliances and close relationships with the Romans, becoming their clients and even adopting Christianity. They were given wealth and privilege and used to maintain control of North Africa, fighting other Amazigh tribes on behalf of the empire in Rome. But when the Muslims came, this disrupted the status quo, and many Amazigh kings feared losing control over their kingdoms, so they joined the Romans in attacking the Muslims. And when the civil wars took place between Yazid and Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the Romans took advantage of the chaos and recaptured the territory between Morocco and Tunisia. But when the civil war and the caliphate ended, the Muslims came back to finish their conquests. Under the reign of al-Malik ibn Marwan, the Muslims managed to capture the city of Carthage, a vital naval base and a port by which the Romans sent local grains to feed their populations. It was the Roman capital city in the region, and after it fell, the Romans had lost all hope of retaking North Africa from the Muslims. However, this also led to a last stand by some of the Amazigh tribes who now united under a single unified kingdom. Their ruler was Queen Dihya, also known as al-Kahina, the sorceress, by the Muslims, as she was said to have practiced witchcraft and fortune-telling. For 5 years, Queen Dihya managed to fight off the Umayyads, initially defeating them in battle and forcing them to retreat. She then used scorched earth tactics, burning orchards and farmland wherever she went to deny the Muslims any resources for their armies. But in doing so, she also destroyed the livelihoods of many Amazigh tribes, so those tribes defected and joined the Umayyad armies. With these Amazigh tribes now on the side of the Muslims, Queen Dihya was eventually killed in battle, and her kingdom quickly fell apart. Soon after, the rest of the Amazigh tribes came to the Muslims and submitted to their authority. They were then allowed to keep their lands and join the Muslim armies in continuing their conquests, and many of them even accepted this offer and even converted to Islam. It was these Amazigh tribes that would go on to lead the conquests of Portugal and Spain, with the famous commander Tariq ibn Ziyad coming from them. And of course, we'll have an entire documentary series on Al-Andalus coming after the Umayyads. Much like in North Africa, the civil wars between Yazid and Abdullah ibn Zubayr caused the Muslims to lose ground in Central Asia, with many of the lands that they had conquered now being retaken by local tribes and kingdoms. But when the civil war ended and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf had put down the last of the rebellions, the Khalifas, al-Malik and later his son Walid, allowed him to build up an army and restart the conquests to the east. To the north, Qutayba ibn Muslim was sent to conquer the lands of modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And following these victories, he marched his armies into the Fergana Valley, an oasis of rich and fertile land in the middle of an otherwise dry and desolate region. This would be the land in which the Muslims first came into contact with the Chinese armies, leading to a rivalry between the two great empires, though we'll cover that story in a future documentary. To the south, Muhammad ibn al-Qasim was sent to conquer the land of Sind, a kingdom that lay where the Indus River meets the Arabian Sea, making it one of the most strategically important lands in the periphery. There, pirates along the coast continuously raided cargo ships traveling to and from the Arabian Peninsula. The latest of these raids was known as the Ceylon Ship Incident, an event in which a ship with gifts sent from Sri Lanka to the Umayyads was attacked and the people on board were carried off and taken prisoner. This led Hajjaj to write a letter to the king of Sind, demanding that he deal with the pirates that were taking refuge in his kingdom. But when the king refused, saying that the pirates were beyond his control, Hajjaj gave Muhammad ibn al-Qasim the green light to conquer the land. And with that, all of Sind soon fell to the Muslims, and the pirate bases along the coast of Sind were each besieged and destroyed. The conquest of Sind was the furthest the Muslims would push into the Indian subcontinent for the next few hundred years. It was only after the rise of the Turks in Central Asia that further conquests in India would take place. Of course, we'll also be covering the entire history of Islam in India in a future documentary. For 30 years under the rule of al-Malik and his son Walid, the Umayyad Caliphate saw a period of great stability and development, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the time of Muawiyah. And through that stability, they were able to develop and fund and successfully carry out massive state-building projects that would ultimately make the Muslim state one of the great civilizations, rivaling the Romans and the Persians. Under Umayyad rule, the Muslim Caliphate became the largest empire to have ever existed up until that point, covering more land than all other empires before it. If al-Malik and his son Walid hadn't developed a courier system, a new currency, or unified provinces under a single language, it's very likely that the empire wouldn't have lasted and the entire caliphate would have fragmented into many kingdoms. They were master lawmakers and skillful politicians, and during their time, the Umayyads reached the height of their influence and culture, leaving behind a blueprint of an empire that many future Muslim kingdoms would follow. But while their rule was considered the pinnacle of Umayyad civilization, al-Malik and Walid were not the most moral of the Umayyads. Rather, there was a dark side to their kingdoms as well.
The Mawali system.
When Omar ibn al-Khattab conquered the lands of the Roman and Persian empires, the people were broadly divided into two main classes, Muslims and non-Muslims. Muslims were given full rights within the empire, and they were the equivalent of citizens in any modern country. However, with their rights came huge responsibilities, and they were eligible for conscription, joining the army that protected the caliphate, while non-Muslims were free to stay at home. The non-Muslims in general were considered dhimmis, meaning protected people, and they were given most but not all of the rights of citizens. The equivalent to this would be a permanent resident or a holder of a green card status in most modern countries. The state would give them money and relief when they needed it, and they were free to practice their own religion and even use their own courts for solving their own disputes. Omar would also regularly sack his own governors if anyone came in complaining of injustice, including complaints from non-Muslims. But since the non-Muslims weren't eligible for conscription, the way that they would support the army was through paying a special tax. This tax was called jizya, and at the time it was 2 dinars each year, around $500 US, with only adult able-bodied men being required to pay it. The poor, the elderly, the monks without income, women, minors, and the mentally or physically disabled were all exempt from this jizya. Non-Muslims were also not required to pay the zakat, a tax of 2.5% on all accumulated wealth that was levied every year on the Muslims. Kharaj was the only other tax that non-Muslims may have had to have paid, though this was only levied on landowners. This was a land tax that was also paid by Muslims depending on the type of land that was owned. The main priority of Umar ibn al-Khattab had been to spread the message of Islam and establish justice in the land. But under the Umayyads, the priorities changed and they focused on state building and projects of grandeur that ultimately required huge amounts of money to fund it. Soon the Umayyads began increasing the jizya amounts and sending armies into the Roman territories to plunder for war booty. They also conquered many new lands in search of wealth and resources, not necessarily with the priority of spreading their religion. In fact, this soon became a problem for them because as people continued to live under the Muslim Caliphate, people began flocking to Islam in droves. Some were converting out of sincerity to Allah, while others were converting to avoid paying the jizya tax or to gain some kind of privileges within the Muslim government. But in the end, the result was the same. The Umayyad treasury was losing money because less people were paying jizya, and the wealth that came from zakat was limited to being spent on only 8 things.
إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل فريضة من الله والله عليم حكيم.
You could not build the great Umayyad Masjid, for example, with zakat. This really became a problem when peasants began pouring into the cities, converting to Islam in order to join the Muslim army, as they would be given a stable salary and their families would receive stipends even after they died. The army also gave the opportunity for social mobility, as people could rise in the ranks and now go on to have successful careers. This was such a drain on the treasury, and the Umayyads now realized that they had put themselves in a corner as they had created an economy that was fully reliant on collecting jizya for its revenue. This was because the caliphate was overwhelmingly non-Muslim, with Muslims in many provinces making up less than 5 to 10% of the entire population. But now that tax base was exponentially shrinking every year as the Muslim population grew, and soon they decided to do something completely bizarre and even antithetical to the message of Islam. They began to encourage people not to convert, in the hopes that their tax revenues wouldn't reduce. In order to do this, they created 2 new classes of people, both of which were Muslims in faith, though neither of which were given the full rights of Muslims. The Umayyad social hierarchy looked something like this. At the top you had Arab Muslims. These were citizens with full rights. Then just below them you had the Mawla or the Mawali. These were clients. These were people who converted to Islam and who were sponsored by an Arab tribe and attested to their Islam. They would be treated as Muslims by the state. Third were the Ajam, or the non-Arab Muslims. These were people that had converted to Islam but who were not sponsored by an Arab tribe. The Umayyads considered them legally non-Muslim. And then finally you had Ahl al-Kitab, which were the Christians and the Jews and the Sabians and the Zoroastrians. They were also known as Ahl al-Dhimma, or the protected people. Some later rulers also included Hindus in this category when they encountered them during their expansions into India. And finally you also had the Uluj, or the barbarians. These were usually foreigners who are not considered Muslim or from Ahl al-Kitab. This classification was usually reserved for pagan Europeans, generally beyond the borders of the Umayyad lands. The first of these 2 new categories was the Mawla class, the non-Arab peoples whose Islam was verified by the state. In order to do this, the Umayyads put them through humiliating tests, including checking whether the person was circumcised or not. These Mawlas were also required to be vouched for and sponsored by one of the Arab tribes in the caliphate. At that point, they would be considered fully Muslim, though they were still considered a second class beneath the Arab Muslims. In pre-Islamic Arabia, Mawlas were ex-slaves that had been freed and adopted by an Arab tribe, becoming almost a part of the family. The most famous of these was, of course, Zayd ibn Haritha, a slave that the Prophet ﷺ had freed and even adopted as his own son. He was the Mawla of the Prophet ﷺ. The Umayyads, however, took that concept of slavery and sponsorship and applied it to all non-Arabs who converted to Islam. The second of these new classes was then the Ajam, the non-Arab people whose Islam was not verified by the state and who had not been sponsored by one of the Arab tribes. These people were Muslim in faith but were not recognized as Muslims. This meant that they had to pay the jizya tax. They couldn't join the army, they couldn't marry other Muslims, and they couldn't even go for Hajj. And they had to be buried in non-Muslim graveyards. This was a clear policy of oppression, and the Umayyads stepped way beyond their boundaries. But their justification was that the people were converting to Islam simply as part of a tax evasion scheme, and so they shouldn't be given the privileges they sought. An equivalent example to this reasoning would be like a man who kills his own father in an attempt to take his rightful inheritance. But even though the inheritance is his right, giving him that inheritance would encourage others to do the same, and so the state ultimately confiscates that inheritance. If people became Muslim without true faith and then received their jizya exemption, then it would encourage everyone to pretend to be Muslim as well. So the Umayyads withheld their privileges and treated them as non-Muslims in order to prevent people from converting for the wrong reasons. This was their logic, but it goes against the way of the Prophet ﷺ himself. He accepted anyone's conversion to Islam as sincere unless the person later committed an act of kufr. But even then, many people repented and came back to Islam as the religion took hold of their hearts. And what purpose does the Muslim caliphate serve if it is not there to bring new nations into Islam? Rather, by the Umayyads preventing people from becoming new Muslims, they were working against the core purpose of the caliphate. The Mawla system was something invented by the Umayyads, and while certain elements would continue on into other caliphates, the idea of Arab supremacy was completely dropped and people would no longer be prevented from converting to Islam. We'll be discussing changes to the Mawla system that were made under the Abbasids when we get to their documentary as well, inshallah. From a political perspective, al-Malik and Walid made very few mistakes. However, through their political machinations, they often chose to forego a higher morality, as sometimes the more moral choice wasn't the most beneficial to the state. Rather, it was the next two successors that would far outshine them in this regard, becoming among the most righteous of the Umayyad Khalifas. Only Muawiyah could compete with them in this regard, though he had an unfair advantage as he was given the blessing of being Sahabi of the Prophet ﷺ.
منكم من يريد الدنيا ومنكم من يريد الآخرة.
Sulaiman, the second son of al-Malik.
When Walid died in 715, the caliphate was then transferred to his brother Sulaiman ibn al-Malik. In general, Sulaiman was considered a righteous man towards the end of his life, having only ruled as a khalifa for 3 years before passing away. During that time, he was known to keep the Islamic scholars close to him, taking their advice when making his decisions. He was also personally spiritual, always fearing that his soldiers may kill someone unjustly. And he was even known to often cry whenever people advised him, warning him to fear Allah, as being the Khalifa came with a heavy responsibility. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf had also passed away at this point, and Sulaiman sought to undo much of the evil that he had done. He replaced all of his governors and released all of his political prisoners, attempting to reconcile with the people of Iraq. Sulaiman was also known to be lenient and forgiving towards the people, even making a new policy of separating the tax collectors from the local governors. This was part of his campaign to prevent any abuse of the people, thus ending Hajjaj's policy of politically motivated fines and punitive confiscations. Then, of course, there was the issue of delaying prayers that some Umayyads had become known for. In many cases, governors would use the Friday prayer as an excuse to give long speeches of propaganda, sometimes even delaying the prayer so long that they ended up missing the prescribed prayer times. Sulaiman knew that this was wrong, of course, so he banned this practice outright, and he made sure that all prayers were restored to their original times. How would you act when you were under the rulers who would delay the prayer beyond its prescribed time? observe the prayer time at its proper time on your own. And if you can pray it along with the rulers after that, then do so, for it would be a nafil prayer for you. But while Suleiman was better than some of the others in terms of morality and iman, he wasn't a cunning politician, and he made some blunderous mistakes. Perhaps the worst of these was his attempt to conquer Constantinople for a second time, not learning from the mistakes of the first attempt some 40 years before. During the civil war between Yazid and Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the Roman Empire took advantage of the chaos to reconquer the lands of Armenia to the north. They also supported a number of Christian rebel groups in the Levant, known as the Mardites, hoping to destabilize the Muslims and put more pressure on the caliphate. But eventually the Romans recalled the Mardites to the Roman lands in exchange for payments of tributes from the Muslims. These payments of tributes were part of a new peace agreement between the Romans and the Umayyads. But the Romans soon broke their own treaty when they tried to attack the Muslim economy and subvert Muslim authority on the island of Cyprus. At the time, the Muslims and the Romans had a unique agreement in which they shared the island with its revenues being split between them. This was known as the Arab-Byzantine Condominium, in which Cyprus was demilitarized and the island was jointly ruled. But the Romans forcibly deported thousands of Cypriots, taking them back to the Roman lands, thus undercutting the labor that drove the island's economy. They also took control of the Church of Cyprus, subjugating the remaining Christians on the island to the control of the Roman government in Constantinople. This was a major attack on the resources of the caliphate, as Cyprus played a huge role in the Muslim economy. It was also a massive shipping port with huge depots of copper. And because it acted as a neutral buffer zone, it reduced the costs of heavy militarization and prevented the Romans from starting an all-out war. But now that the Romans had subverted Muslim authority on the island, the Caliph at the time, al-Malik, began an invasion of Anatolia, taking back Armenia in the process. The Muslim armies delivered a number of crushing defeats to the Romans. In response, the Roman emperor punished his armies and even imprisoned one of his generals who had been defeated by the Muslims. When the general was eventually released, he began a rebellion and deposed the emperor, beginning a period of extreme instability known as the 20 Years' Anarchy. Between 695 and 717, 6 different Roman emperors would rise and fall. And during that time, al-Malik and later his son Walid would continue a series of unending raids into Roman territories. But eventually, when Suleiman ibn al-Malik became the Khalifa, he decided to take advantage of the chaos and tried to put an end to the Roman Empire once and for all. In 517, Suleiman sent one of the largest armies the Umayyads had ever assembled, and together with over 100,000 men, they marched through the lands of Anatolia, eventually arriving at the walls of Constantinople. There, they camped alongside the city, sowing their own crops and building their own houses in preparation for a very long siege. At the time, a fleet of ships supported the army with a constant supply of food and equipment. But while the Muslims had a powerful army, the walls of Constantinople were famous for their ability to withstand any attack. So rather than try and take the city by storm, the Muslims decided to exploit the civil strife within the Roman Empire and back one of the candidates who was fighting for the throne. That candidate was Leo the Isaurian, who agreed to help the Muslims if they would help him secure the throne. Once Leo was in power, he would surrender Constantinople to the Muslims with the understanding that he would act as a puppet emperor under Muslim control. But when Leo managed to actually seize the throne for himself, he began a series of negotiation tactics, feigning his support for the Muslims, while in reality he was only trying to destroy them. He told them that the people of Constantinople had almost agreed to surrender, but they were worried that the Arabs would stay there for a long time and ravage their lands. And so he suggested that the Muslims burn their own supplies and take down their winter huts. But when they complied, he simply refused to surrender, having gotten what he wanted. At the same time, the Muslims sent their fleet of ships to control the waters around the city. But a sudden change of wind pushed the ships in range of the enemy flamethrowers. This was the same Greek fire that had been used to defeat the Muslims in the first siege of Constantinople. And now they lost control of the seas, so the Romans could resupply while they could not. Soon, an exceptionally cold winter would overcome them, and for over 3 months, snow covered the ground. And with their supplies burned down and their ships unable to supply them, starvation set in, and diseases soon followed. After more than a year of campaigning, the Muslims were forced to retreat back to the Levant. This defeat was a massive failure for the Umayyads, and it put a huge strain on the government treasury. And there were even discussions of abandoning the furthest provinces, fearing they could no longer support them financially. But while the Umayyads were panicking and reconsolidating their power, the Romans all of a sudden began to fight from a renewed sense of confidence. For the first time in over 20 years, they united behind a single emperor, Leo the Isaurian, and now they began to regain control over the entire Anatolian peninsula. As Suleiman ibn al-Malik was coming to the end of his life, the question of who would succeed him became the most pressing matter. His younger brother Yazid II was next in line for the throne, but just like Yazid I before him, he was not known to be a righteous man. So the scholars advised Suleiman to find a way to keep Yazid II out of power, fearing that he would bring fitna and corruption to the Muslims. Suleiman then suggested giving the caliphate to his son Dawood, as he would be considered a legitimate alternative to the throne that the ruling elite may accept. But Dawood was soon killed in battle, dying a shaheed, while Suleiman's other sons were too young to rule. This option now quickly became an impossibility. So Suleiman gathered the scholars in order to decide what to do. The next Khalifa needed to be someone who was righteous while also being politically capable of ruling over a vast caliphate. Quickly they realized who the best choice of the next Khalifa would be. It was a man from among the elite of the Umayyads and a previous governor of the city of Medina. Suleiman and the scholars unanimously agreed on him, but if they announced it at the time, it may have caused another civil war between the Umayyad elites. So they agreed to write his name in a letter and seal it, only revealing it after everyone had already sworn an oath of allegiance to whoever's name was in it. Soon after that, Suleiman ibn al-Malik passed away, and the Umayyad elite were all gathered together, anticipating that the next Khalifa would surely be another from Abd al-Malik's lineage. But as the successor was announced, the Umayyads fell back in surprise and shock. The next Khalifa would be Suleiman's paternal cousin, completely outside of Abd al-Malik's lineage. The scholars warned the Umayyads not to break their oaths of allegiance or try to rebel, as anyone who went back on their promise would be met with violence. They were desperate to keep the peace and avoid another civil war. And now the new Khalifa would have to lead the caliphate despite resistance from some of his own family who deeply resented him. His name was Omar ibn al-Aziz, and he was the greatest of the Umayyads after Muawiyah, though none of the young Umayyads could compete with Muawiyah, as he had been a Sahabi of the Prophet ﷺ, praying behind him in the Masjid of Medina and risking his life in jihad for him.
Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, Umar II.
When the second Rashidun Khalifa, Omar ibn al-Khattab, was ruling over the Muslims, every night he would disguise himself and patrol the city of Medina. There he would ask people about their opinions on the Khalifa, and this way he could understand their true concern and their true issues and try to help them however he could. One night he rested by the walls of a house, and there he began to hear the voices of a woman and her daughter. It seems that they were preparing milk to sell at the market the next day, and the mother ordered her daughter to dilute the milk with water so that they would have more milk to sell. The daughter refused, saying that the Khalifa, Omar, had prohibited such a practice. So the mother replied that Omar wasn't there to hear them. The daughter then responded, if Omar doesn't see us, then Omar's Lord, Allah, sees us. Omar was so impressed with these words that he told his servant to mark the house and come back the next day. There the servant would buy some milk and testify that it was pure and without any delusion. The daughter stayed true to Allah. So Omar gathered his sons, saying that he was old and no longer interested in marriage, but that he advised one of them proposed to that daughter, as she was a righteous woman. At that, Asim ibn Umar agreed with the idea, and he went to the woman, who then accepted his proposal. No one knows what this woman's name was, but the history books always remember her as the Milk Maiden. And from their marriage was born another righteous woman, who, as it turns out, became the mother of Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz. Umar ibn al-Khattab was the great-grandfather of Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, and we shall soon see that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. When he was the governor of Medina, my husband, Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, may God have mercy on him, had devoted himself entirely to the Muslims and had set his mind on their affairs. When evening came and he had not finished that day's needs, he would call for his lamp, which was lit at his own expense. Then he would pray 2 rak'at. One day he crouched down and put his head in his hands, and tears streamed down his cheeks. He sobbed all night, such that it seemed like his heart might split or that his soul might depart, until the early morning dawn appeared. I finally approached him and asked him, "What has brought you to this state?" And he said, "Today I was told I've been put in charge of this community. Every one of them is the Khalifa." Then I thought of the poor who are hungry, and the traveler who is lost, and the captive who is oppressed, and the one with little wealth and many dependents, and others like them in the furthest reaches of the land and at the ends of the earth. I know that Allah, mighty and majestic, will question me about them, and that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam will argue with me regarding them. Allah will not accept from me any excuse about them, nor will I have any argument to make before the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. By Allah, I felt such pity for myself that my eyes weep and my heart aches. The more I remember, the more fearful I become. So either keep me awake or leave me be. Indeed, Omar ibn al-Aziz had been a righteous man even before becoming Khalifa. However, he also enjoyed the luxuries of life to the point where he would spend thousands of dollars on a single item of clothing, or that he would never appear in public with the same outfit twice. But in that moment, he realized the weight of the world was on his shoulders, and with this new level of responsibility, he now had to give up everything in his life. He then turned to his wife and told her she would need to either join him in giving up all luxuries or divorce him with dignity. Choose. Either return your jewelry to the public treasury or permit me to part from you. For I cannot bear for you, me, and this jewelry to be under one roof together. His wife Fatima, as righteous as she was, chose her husband and Jannah above all else. The Prophet ﷺ had a similar conversation with his wives as recorded in the Quran.
يا أيها النبي قل لأزواجك إن كنتن تردن الحياة الدنيا وزينتها فتعالين أمتعكن وأسرحكن سراحا جميلا.
When Umar ibn al-Aziz took office, he began a series of reforms to the government, just as Umar ibn al-Khattab had done before him. His first order of business was to drain the swamp, sacking and demoting government employees who had been involved in corruption. Anyone who had embezzled funds or overcharged zakat or jizya were then tried and punished, with many of them being exiled to islands off the coast of Eritrea as a particularly severe punishment. Then he began building bridges with those who had rebelled against the previous governments, including the Khawarij, who were still causing problems in the caliphate. Surprisingly, they made peace with him and accepted his rule, only saying that if Yazid II got into power after him, they would pick up their arms once again and fight. Soon, we will find out why everyone was so afraid of Yazid II getting into power. Next, Umar ibn al-Aziz saw how the Umayyads had been using wealth from the treasury to fund their own lavish lifestyles. Governors had given themselves huge salaries and had taken public land for their own homes and palaces. So Umar confiscated all of these properties and reduced their salaries to the same level as everyone else. He also forbade government employees from receiving gifts, as they could be seen as bribes. And to prevent insider trading, no one working for the government was allowed to invest in any businesses. Government employees were there to serve the people, not to enrich themselves. The advisor to Umar ibn al-Aziz once visited him at home at night, and on his desk were 2 candles, only one of them lit. As they discussed matters of the state, the candle continued to burn, but as soon as the conversation turned to personal matters, Umar II told him to wait. He snuffed out the candle and lit the other one, and then continued with the conversation. A candle that was funded by the government would be lit for him while he was occupied with the Muslims' affairs. But when he finished, he would extinguish it and light his own lamp when dealing with his own personal affairs. Then there was the issue of tax collection, where the Umayyads used to take money from one land and spend it on another. This created a huge imbalance in the quality of life between the provinces, with lands like Khorasan becoming almost completely neglected. Taxes were now to be spent in the lands that they were taken from, just as the people paying the money should be taken care of before other neighboring lands were helped. This led to reports that in places like North Africa, so much wealth now circulated in these provinces that poverty had been completely eradicated and there was no one left to give charity to. So Omar then told them to use the wealth to fix their streets and to give to the Christians and to build bridges and to feed the birds. And only after they did all of that could they begin sending money to other regions next door. All of this was part of his vision to decentralize the state. He believed that by making each province self-reliant, it would strengthen the caliphate as a whole. I, for example, often travel to the US to find a land of extreme poverty, despite it being the wealthiest country on earth. What would happen if they began spending on their own people rather than sending all of their money abroad to fund other countries' wars? Perhaps their population would escape destitution and drug addiction and live lives in good health and dignity. Under the Mawali system, many of the non-Arabs in the army were treated unfairly, with their salaries often withheld and their privileges limited. Seeing this, Omar initiated a policy of equality between the Arabs and the non-Arabs. Mawlas would now be given the same salary and benefits as the Arabs, and they could be promoted to the ranks that had previously been forbidden to them. He also began to reform the budget of the army, deciding to focus mainly on defensive jihad rather than offensive. Under the previous Umayyad rulers, raids had been regularly launched against the Roman Empire, a huge expense that Omar saw as a waste of money. But some historians make the argument that this was one of his few mistakes as Khalifa, as he had now significantly reduced the income of the state. These raids used to bring back spoils of war to the treasury, and by conquering new lands, the tax base had the potential to increase. Furthermore, because he was treating the Mawlas as equals and giving them full privileges, the budget of the army grew exponentially, adding further strain on the treasury. Perhaps if he had continued the conquests, he would have made his people wealthier, and the Muslims wouldn't have stopped in Spain, but rather conquered France and Italy as well. Omar's government was heavily focused on implementing justice and spreading Islam. So he began sending scholars across the world as far as India and China. This way, knowledge of the religion could be brought to all the different lands, rather than having the scholars isolate themselves in Medina and Kufa. He also began writing letters to kings all around the world, encouraging them to convert to Islam and bring their people with them. In one case, for example, he even offered the previous king of Sind half of his kingdom back if he converted to Islam. And because he had stopped the offensive jihads, they understood that these invitations were not threats. Then there were the government employees who had not been sacked. He commanded them to fear Allah and obey the Sharia and not transgress against the rights of the people. He would surround himself with scholars and seek their advice on all his policies, and he would command them to remind him daily about the world after death, the Akhirah, and he would forbid them from speaking to him about the frivolous world of the living, or the dunya. Finally, there was the Friday khutbah, which had been abused by the Umayyads, acting as propaganda for the masses. A number of governors would regularly curse the people of Banu Hashim, as they had been rivals to the clan of Banu Umayyah. But these pre-Islamic rivalries should have been resolved by now, as Islam came to unite the people. So Umar chose an ayah of the Quran, and he recited it at the end of the khutbahs, replacing the immoral and oppressive cursing.
إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون.
This tradition remains even until this day. Omar also began the practice of preserving a hadith in written form, but we'll talk more about the compilation of the hadith when we discuss it in the chapter on the Abbasid Caliphate. After ruling the Caliphate for less than 3 short years, Omar ibn al-Aziz suddenly passed away at the young age of 40. But while the date of his death is clear, the circumstances surrounding it are not. And there are 2 opposing narratives that describe the cause of his untimely demise. When Umar ibn al-Aziz gave up all luxuries in his life, he also considered most foods to be a luxury. So throughout the entirety of his reign, he kept an extremely simple diet consisting mostly of plain lentils and hard, dry bread. Soon he began to grow pale and shrivel in size, becoming fragile and weak from his poor diet. On top of that, he was overburdened by endless work, enjoying very few hours of sleep. Eventually, he fell ill with a sickness, possibly tuberculosis, brought on by his weakened immune system. And after 20 days in bed, his body finally succumbed and he passed away, leaving behind no inheritance for his 12 sons. My sons, by God, I have not withheld from you any right that was yours, nor would I ever take people's wealth to give it to you. You are one of two kinds of men. If you are righteous, then Allah cares for the righteous. And if you are not, I will not leave you wealth that would help you to disobey Allah. He was truly the great-grandson of Umar ibn al-Khattab. When the last Khalifa, Sulaiman ibn al-Malik, had named Omar II as his successor, he knew that his two brothers, Yazid II and Hisham, wouldn't be satisfied with this decision. So he added in a clause to the letter saying that after Omar II died, the caliphate would be returned to them. This prevented a civil war from breaking out in the beginning of Umar's reign, and as the two brothers knew that they just needed to wait. But it also put a target on Umar's back, as his death was now the only thing stopping them from gaining power again. But if this wasn't bad enough, Omar began radically deviating from the status quo, taking the wealth that the Umayyads had built up and removing them from their positions of power. If this continued, their entire business structure would collapse and their hold on power would be taken away from them forever. So they went to Omar's servant and they offered him an enormous amount of money to kill him. 1,000 gold dinars, worth over $500,000 US today. This was life-changing money for a mere servant. So he laced Umar's food with poison. But when Umar noticed something was off with his food, he questioned the servant, promising not to punish him if he told him the truth. The servant then admitted his mistake, and Umar let him go free. And 20 days later, he finally passed away. If this version of the story is true, then it is strangely similar to the story of Hassan ibn Ali. In that case as well, he was poisoned and the true murderer wasn't named. But in both of those cases, one of the Umayyad princes stood to gain control over the caliphate. And in the case of Hassan, it was Yazid I. In the case of Umar, it was Yazid II. The similarities between the two are eerily poetic. When Umar ibn al-Aziz passed away, his wife Fatima was asked if she wanted her jewelry back from the treasury. At this she remarked, "I gave it up willingly while Umar was alive. Why would I take it back after his death? Wallahi, never." She lived the rest of her life loyal to the promise she had made to her husband and to Allah, giving up all luxuries in her life.
The first Mujaddid in Islam.
Allah will raise from this ummah at the end of every 100 years the one who will revive its religion for it. Throughout history of humanity, there have always been prophets to deliver the message of Allah. And as we see with the story of Ben Israel, a single ummah could have many prophets. But as these prophets passed away and the next generations came, their message was often distorted and new innovations were brought into the religion. Sometimes people purposefully distorted them, as in an act of sabotage against the prophets. This was clearly the case in Christianity when Paul invented a new religion in the name of Isa alayhi salam. But in other cases, these innovations may come about with good intentions. In the case of the pre-Islamic Arabia, many of the idols had actually been statues of righteous men to remind people of their wisdoms. But over the generations, people went beyond their limits, and the reverence of these great people eventually turned into worship. But Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was destined to be the last of the prophets. And so after him, only the Quran and his Sunnah would remain to guide all people until the end of time. When Isa alayhi salam was taken from this earth, it would be just 600 years before the next prophet came. But within this time, so much confusion took place that the people split up into different religions and sects, each one arguing with the other. Both Christianity and modern rabbinic Judaism were newly invented religions after the disappearance of Isa alayhi salam. Both of these religions were offshoots of the original religion of the prophets, the worship of Allah alone and complete submission to Him. So how is it that Islam can continue undistorted even though 1400 years have passed since the last prophet? This is because the Quran and Sunnah have been preserved, unlike the books and traditions of the past ummahs. But in addition to both of these, Allah has also sent us a further mercy. People that will come after every 100 years to restore Islam in some way and to correct the people in their faith. These people are known as the Mujaddids. And the scholars unanimously agree that Omar ibn al-Aziz was the first Mujaddid in our history. He ruled as the Khalifa in the year 100 Hijri, and under his rule, justice was established and corruption was destroyed. It is even said that the people were so affected by him that they began to compete with each other in prayer and good deeds rather than sitting around and gossiping. But as Islam continued to spread across the world and the ummah grew larger, new Mujaddids would come and revive Islam in different lands. It's very possible that there were multiple Mujaddids that existed at the same time, as there is no sign or proof that any single person is a Mujaddid. Rather, it is simply a description of different people who decide to help to revive the ummah in whatever way they can. Everyone has the ability to become a mujaddid, but it is only through the will of Allah that certain people are more successful in reviving the ummah than others. It does not necessarily mean that for every 100 years, only one mujaddid will come. It may be carried out by a group of people.
One of the reasons that I'm writing this book, The Entire History of Islam, is because it's never been done before. Never has a book covered the entire history of this ummah, from Brazil and the Caribbean in the West to the Muslim kingdoms in China and the Philippines and Vietnam. Never has a book explained what happened to the Sahaba of Isa alayhi salam, or who the people of the ditch were from Surah al-Buruj, or what happened to the Injil after Isa alayhi salam was taken up by Allah, or how Isa alayhi salam had a Khalifa after he left. These make up only a small fraction of the book that I'm writing, a collection of our entire history, 1,000 pages long. And it's because of how big and how extensive it is, I need to hire historians and scholars to both help me in my research and to correct me when I make mistakes. That's why I'm opening up pre-orders now, so that I can use the money to fund the completion of this book, a book that will be the most important of our generation. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And if you pre-order the book, I will literally write your name into the book so that the future generations know and recognize that it was you who was the reason that this book could even exist in the first place. May Allah give your name a legacy that this ummah will never forget. Ameen.
Deep in the deserts of Arabia, you'll find an old palace that was built by a forgotten Umayyad prince. And here he hid himself away from the rest of the world, enjoying the pleasures of wine and debaucherous women. And as he waited for the Khalifa to die, he knew his turn to rule would be next. So he intended to set up a tent on top of the Kaaba and enjoy his lusts there while the people performed Hajj all around. But what would the end be for such a man who ended up surrounded in that palace as he picked up the Quran for one last time, knowing that his time was coming to an end? This is the story of the last Umayyad Khalifas and the terrible corruption they brought to their people. But from the shadows, a new caliphate would soon rise, a mysterious cult that would overthrow their kingdom. And with them was a man they called the Chosen One.
Return of the Caliphate to Abd al-Malik's sons.
With Umar ibn al-Aziz now passed away, the caliphate was transferred back to the sons of al-Malik. Yazid II was the next to take power, and to everyone's surprise, for the first 40 days of his reign, he continued the policies of Umar II. But this didn't last long, as he began to revert all of the reforms that Umar had made, eventually bringing back the old Umayyad style of governance. But perhaps part of the reason for his reversion back to the status quo was because of a sudden prison break in the nearby land of Aleppo. There, an old rival had managed to escape from captivity, hoping to save his own neck before Yazid II consolidated power. This man's name was Yazid ibn al-Muhallib, a fierce warrior and commander who had been a staunch rival of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. And when Sulaiman ibn al-Malik began removing the allies of Hajjaj from power, Yazid ibn al-Muhallib was made the governor of Iraq, and he began persecuting all of Hajjaj's old followers. But eventually he was caught embezzling government funds funds, and Umar ibn al-Aziz had him arrested and put in prison. And there he lived a somewhat comfortable life, as he still had a lot of support from the people in power and many of the prison officials. But now that Yazid II had taken the throne, it seemed as if the days of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf were coming back now, as many of his old allies were now being reinstated into positions of power. So Yazid ibn al-Muhallib gave whatever bribes he needed to give in order to escape. He then went back to Iraq and raised an army in rebellion against the tyrants. Quickly, he managed to capture Basra and the new Iraqi capital of Wasit, and from there he began threatening Yazid II's fledgling regime. But in the end, the Umayyad armies descended upon the rebels and crushed them in battle, and Yazid ibn al-Muhallib was killed in the fray, while much of his family was later rounded up and executed. But Yazid II wouldn't live much longer, as within only a few years he too would pass away, and with his sudden death, the last of al-Malik's sons would soon take the throne. But in their eternal struggle between righteousness and evil, the Umayyads would have one last Khalifa of high character and virtue, and for the next 20 long years he would hold the caliphate together while forces of war and rebellion viciously tried to tear it all apart. Towards the east, in the lands of Central Asia, a mysterious army appeared on the horizon and began to raid the Muslim lands, taking them by surprise. But as they won battle after battle, their raids soon became full-blown invasions as they began to occupy the territories in Transoxiana and threaten Khurasan. In response, the new Khalifa Hisham was forced to send an army to the Fergana Valley, hoping to recover his losses and push back those invaders. But that army was quickly routed and forced into a desperate retreat, trying to make their way back to the fortified city of Samarkand. But many of them would not make it back home, as during their retreat they ran out of food and water. Suffering from hunger and exhaustion, without a drop of water to drink, the mysterious invaders attacked them, slaughtering much of the army. That day would be known as the Day of Thirst, a massive tragedy for the Muslim Caliphate, and for many years after, Umayyad control over Transoxiana would completely collapse as the Muslims would be pushed into the defensive for over a decade. These mysterious invaders would be known as the Turugesh, and they were being supported by the Chinese Empire against the Muslim Caliphate. Their story will be explored later when we begin the documentary on the rise of the Turks in Central Asia. But these invasions in the east came at a time when the region was already being fragmented, as conflicts between pro-Hajjaj and anti-Hajjaj factions were now tearing the east apart. This had been caused by the previous Khalifas all choosing one side while oppressing the other, but Hisham remained neutral, following in Omar ibn al-Aziz's example, skillfully managing the chaos between the two sides. These problems of invasions and internal conflict would remain prevalent throughout the nearly 20 years of his reign, and waves of new enemies would appear on the borders of the Caliphate, attacking the Muslims in Spain and Anatolia and Central Asia and the Caucasus region. But for every new challenge, Hisham would rise above them all and hold the empire together. That was until a single event that would take Morocco away from the Caliphate forever. Towards the west, in the lands of North Africa, the Amazigh people still found themselves under the Mawali system, just like the people of Khurasan. And because of this, despite many of them being Muslim, they were still forced to pay the jizya tax with zakat added on top of it. So unsurprisingly, many of the Amazigh people began listening to the calls of the Khawarij. These people had been preaching a message of rebellion and trying to gain Amazigh support for an armed revolt against the Umayyads. Soon enough, a rebellion broke out, and the rebels took the Moroccan city of Tangiers. They had timed their revolt precisely as the Umayyad army in Africa had been away conquering Sicily. From there, they continued taking towns and cities until the western coast of Morocco fell to their control. And when the African army eventually returned, the rebels managed to defeat them in battle. In response, Hisham sacked the governor of North Africa and sent an army from Syria to replace him. But by the time they arrived in the lands of North Africa, more people had joined the rebels until they were far outnumbered. A second battle then took place between the Umayyads and the Amazigh, but in the end, the Amazigh prevailed, and the Umayyads were sent home in defeat. No longer would the Umayyads control the lands of Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria, and soon the Amazigh would create their own mini-kingdoms, never to join the Caliphate again. But despite this, Islam continued to be popular in the region and spread among the Amazigh people. Only now, they wouldn't be treated as non-Muslims, even when they sincerely converted to Islam. In the end, Hisham went down as one of the greatest Umayyad Khalifas, having taken a crumbling empire and managing to hold it mostly together. This was because of his meticulous management, even even hiring 40 people to manage the treasury just to ensure that every dirham and dinar was accounted for. But he was also relatively pious and trustworthy, trying to avoid all possible bloodshed wherever he could, and he would keep the scholars close to him in everything he did. Had anyone else been put in his position, perhaps the caliphate would have disintegrated long ago, and proof of this is that when he eventually died, that very fragmentation immediately began to unravel.
The beginning of the third fitna.
The children of al-Malik now passed away, and the baton of leadership would be passed to the next generation. But among them, the first in line for the caliphate was Walid II, the eldest surviving son of Yazid II. And just like his father, he was debaucherous and decadent, though to a degree never before seen. During Hisham's reign, Walid II came into constant conflict with his uncle. So rather than stay in Damascus, he decided to move out and build his own palace in the middle of the desert. There, he would enjoy the most depraved parties full of alcohol and music and women, all while he was waiting for Hisham to die and take his turn as the Khalifa. That party palace would be known as Qusayr Amra, and it still remains deep in the deserts of Jordan. The palace is full of frescoes depicting the parties alongside images of erotes, winged gods in ancient Greek mythology associated with love and desire. When the day finally arrived that he was crowned Khalifa, he decided to go to Mecca for Hajj. But in true debaucherous fashion, he brought with him alcohol and dancing women, intending to entertain himself throughout the pilgrimage. It is said he even intended to put the tent on top of the Kaaba and enjoy himself there, defiling the sanctity of the house of Allah. However, lightning struck his tent and it was completely destroyed. So Walid II took that as a sign to not go that far. But if this wasn't enough, it was said that he began to openly experiment sexually, practicing homosexuality and sodomy, even trying to seduce his own brother. At this, his family could no longer take him, and they began to call for a rebellion against him. No outright kufr or heresy is established against him, but he was well known for wine drinking and sodomy, and they rebelled against him for that. Notice that the scholars didn't make takfir of him, nor did they condone the rebellion against him. Even this level of sin does not make someone a kafir. Rather, there are specific actions and beliefs that take one out of the fold of Islam. Two of Walid II's cousins, Yazid III and Ibrahim, would begin to raise armies against him. And in preparation for their coup, they began spreading news of his crimes in public, causing the people to become outraged with their Khalifa. This came as a shock to Walid II, and he began asking why they would go against him. After all, he had raised all their salaries and taken care of their orphans and widows. And this was true. He had been generous with his money, but this wasn't about a personal dispute or grievance. Despite all of their corruption, the Umayyads were still Muslims in the end of the day, and seeing their Khalifa so openly depraved, they feared for the preservation of the religion and the morals of their society. So Walid II fled from Damascus and went back into the desert, locking himself up in a well-fortified palace. But this time, there was no alcohol, no women, and no musicians. Rather, he knew that this was the end for him and that they would eventually get him. So according to some reports, in one final act of desperate repentance, he turned back to Allah and began praying once again. He had resigned himself to death, and he began reading from the Quran, and for whatever crimes he had committed in the past, he sought forgiveness from Allah. But as the soldiers descended upon him in his palace, they eventually broke in, and there they found him sitting on the floor, reading from the book in a final act of worship. Despite this, they slashed at him, cutting off his head, and they paraded it around for everyone to see. If this is true, he chose to die like his predecessor before him, with the Quran open in his hands, reading from the book of Allah. This was the way that the best of the Umayyads had died before him. Indeed, Uthman ibn Affan was from the Umayyad clan. Every servant would be raised in the same very state in which he dies. Sometimes the worst people turn back to Allah in their final moments, and because of their repentance, Allah causes them to die in the most honorable way. Perhaps Walid II will be raised on the day of resurrection, shrouded in the clothes of Jannah and a Quran in his hands, and Allah knows best. Yazid III and Ibrahim had been responsible for the palace coup, and so Yazid III now took the throne, but to assure the people of the righteousness of their rebellion, he gave them a desperate speech. O people, by Allah, I did not rebel out of insolence or pride, nor out of greed for this world or desire for kingship, nor am I flattering myself, for I would wrong my own soul were Allah not to have mercy on me. I rebelled angry for the sake of Allah and His religion, calling to Allah and to the Sunnah of His Prophet, when the landmarks of guidance had been torn down and the light of the God-fearing extinguished, and a defiant tyrant had appeared, violating every sanctity and mounting every innovation, one who disbelieves in the day of resurrection. Yes, he is my cousin in lineage and my equal in pedigree. When I saw this, I asked Allah's guidance in this affair, and I begged Him not to leave me to myself. Then I called those of my province who would answer, until Allah, by His might, not mine, relieved the servants of Him and purified the lands of Him. People, I pledge to you that I will not pile stone upon stone, nor brick upon brick, nor divert a canal, nor hoard wealth, nor give it to my wives or children, nor move money from one town to another, until I first relieve the poverty of that town and the needs of its people. And if there remains any surplus, I will transfer it to the next town in need. I will not keep you idling in campaigns and thereby tempt you and your families. I will not shut my door in your faces so that your strong prey upon the weak. I will not load your people of the jizya with burdens that drive them out of their homes. I will rule by the book of Allah and the sunnah of His Prophet. I will consult the righteous and resolve any wrongs, remove unjust governors, and restore rights to their people. If I fulfilled this, then praise be to Allah. And if I fall short, then I ask Allah's forgiveness of me and straighten me with your counsel. Allah suffices us, and how excellent a guardian He is. Indeed, this was a moving speech, and perhaps he truly meant the words he was saying, but we will never know, because less than 6 months later, a plague broke out in Damascus, and Yazid III suddenly passed away, and Ibrahim, his brother, would be the next to take the throne. When Yazid III and Ibrahim led a coup against Walid II, this created a fracture in the Umayyad family, with people lining up on either side. And among the supporters of Walid II was a governor by the name of Marwan II, and he raised an army of 80,000 men to take back the caliphate and give it to Walid II's sons instead. But as he was gathering supporters for this counter coup, Yazid III had died, and so now it was only Ibrahim left to stave off this new attack. But hearing the size of the army that had been gathered, he knew that he stood no chance. So he killed Walid II's sons and fled from the city, stealing wealth from the treasury on his way out. He ruled for only 2 months. When Marwan II arrived in Damascus with his army, he was immediately welcomed as the new Khalifa, as there was no one else who can contend for the position. But in one of his first acts as Khalifa, he took the 2 innocent sons of Yazid III and killed them, claiming these executions were vengeance for the killings of Walid II's sons. Blood feuds are absolutely haram in Islam. You cannot kill an innocent person under any circumstances, nor can a son be held responsible for the sins of his father. But Marwan II also had a forgiving side, and when Ibrahim was eventually brought back to Damascus, Marwan II forgave him. Ibrahim then swore a pledge of allegiance to him, though he was only buying time for the future. Ibrahim then left Damascus and secretly began support for another coup. This would now cause a full-blown civil war between the Umayyads, but soon enough, a third party would arise, hoping to take advantage of the infighting within the Umayyads. It's a lesson for us all, how one revolution leads to many others, and how the killing of one ruler opens the door for all hell to break loose.
The Abbasid Revolution.
Throughout the reign of the Umayyads, there had always been a tension between Banu Umayyah and Banu Hashim. These 2 Qurayshi clans had been rivals since the days of Jahiliyyah. And with the family of Ali from Banu Hashim and the family of Muawiyah from Banu Umayyah, this rivalry was only further exacerbated ever since the first fitna had occurred. One of the most influential names from among Banu Hashim was Abu Hashim, who had settled in the faraway town of al-Humayma, deep in the southern part of Jordan. He was the grandson of Ali ibn Abi Talib through his son Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah. This was the son of Ali who had been involved in the uprising by the false prophet Mukhtar al-Thaqafi. Soon, members of Banu Hashim began to flock to him there, and inevitably discussions of overthrowing the Umayyads took place once again. After all, Banu Hashim still felt that they had been robbed of the caliphate, and since the sons of Hassan and Hussein weren't interested in politics, people began looking for new revolutionary leaders. Among these people was a man later known as Muhammad al-Imam. He was the great-grandson of Abbas, the beloved uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, and soon he would become friends with Abu Hashim, and together they would build the Hashemiyya, a clandestine conspiracy to overthrow the Umayyads. But eventually Abu Hashim passed away, and Muhammad al-Imam took his place as the main figurehead of the conspiracy. And although he wasn't a descendant of Ali, the movement accepted him as their leader anyway. Soon he would send out spies and agents to cities all around the caliphate, and they would gather information and sow the seeds of dissent. Before long, the Hashemiyya became a vast yet secretive movement, and Muhammad al-Imam remained in al-Humayma, hidden from the public. But the people at the time didn't know his name nor where he was from. They only spoke of him as al-Rida min al-Muhammad, meaning the chosen one from the family of Muhammad. By keeping their leader secret, they were able to attract a wide range of support, and people from all over the caliphate began to join their conspiracy, whether they were pro-Ali or anti-Umayyad, or even from among the Khawarij. But out of all the places in the caliphate they preached, they found the most success in the Far East, and in particular in the province of Khurasan. This was because the people there had been long neglected by the Umayyads, and because they were non-Arabs that had been overtaxed and mistreated, and their Islam was not accepted by the state. They also sent spies to the various prisons in the caliphate, knowing that the people there deeply resented the Umayyads. Many of those people locked in their cells were in fact political prisoners, and their only crime had been to speak out against injustice. And it's here that they found an imprisoned slave, and one of the strangest mysteries of the movement. He was a man whose name has been lost to history, yet became one of the greatest revolutionary leaders in all of history. This man had been languishing in a prison in Kufa, and when the Hashemiyya found him, they offered to purchase his freedom and adopt him as a mawla to the cause. He became the most brave and loyal follower of the secret Hashemite leader, and he was then sent to Khurasan to begin preparation for the rebellion. They call him Abu Muslim today, though his real name is completely unknown. By now, Muhammad al-Imam had died, and his son Ibrahim al-Imam was leading the Hashemiyya. And as the young Umayyad princes began committing coups and counter-coups against each other, he understood that now was the time to strike. So he sent Abu Muslim a secret message, telling him to begin gathering his army. "O people of Khurasan, the Imam Ibrahim ibn Muslim, great-grandson of the illustrious Sahabi Abdullah ibn Abbas, the Prophet's uncle, has sent me, Abu Muslim, to bring you news of a tremendous victory. We summon you to the Book of Allah and to the Sunnah of His Prophet and to al-Rida min al-Muhammad beneath the black banner until justice is upheld and oppression is removed." The Hashemiyya had become masters of propaganda, with meticulous symbolism used throughout their campaigns. Here, Abu Muslim was given 2 black flags to use in his army, a symbol of steadfastness and vengeance against the enemy, and the exact opposite of the white flags that were being used in the armies of the Umayyads. Every soldier in the army was then ordered to wear fully black clothing, including the sandals on their feet and turbans on their head. This was to associate themselves with the army of the Mahdi at the end of times, as there was a weak hadith describing his army coming from Khurasan dressed in the same clothing. Black banners will come from the east. When you see them, give them allegiance, even if you must crawl over snow, for that is Allah's Khalifa, al-Mahdi. This hadith is weak and not authentic. The army was now ready to launch its revolt against the Umayyads. All they needed to do was go to the public and get the support of the entire nation. During the time of the Umayyads, many small changes had been made to the way that their Eid prayers were conducted. First, the Umayyads added the adhan to call the people for the Eid prayers. The Hashemiyya simply called out as-salatu jami'ah, as-salatu jami'ah, as was the sunnah of the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The second is that they used to give the khutbah first, before the prayer, so that people would be forced to listen to it. The Hashemiyya reverted the khutbah to begin after the prayer. Third, they used to make 4 takbirat in the beginning of each rak'ah. The Hashemiyya reverted it back to 7. Fourth, the Imam used to give the khutbah sitting down on the minbar. The Hashemiyya made him stand up. Notice how some of the changes, such as making the adhan, are still prevalent in our society today. These are still relics from the Umayyad Caliphate. These were only a few of the many changes that the Umayyads had made to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The Imam then explained these changes as the topic of the khutbah, claiming that the Umayyads had corrupted the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and that the Hashemiyya, with their leader from Ahl al-Bayt, had come to restore it. This was so shocking to the people that news of their Eid prayer quickly spread across all of Khurasan, and soon the people began to accept the Hashemiyya as the true leaders of the province, pledging their allegiance to the mysterious figure who was ruling the Hashemiyya cult from the shadows. Reviving the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is one of the main tactics that revolutionary groups in the Islamic world use to gain legitimacy and support among the population. This is in contrast to revolutionary groups in the West that are always trying to go against religion or try to destroy societal norms. This is a sign of the values that are held in each of our societies. Notice the difference. Initially, the Umayyads were oblivious as to what was going on in Khurasan. Marwan II had been busy fighting his cousin Ibrahim, and Khurasan was so far away from Damascus that the Khalifa often didn't pay attention to the province. But when they finally realized the gravity of the situation, they quickly mobilized to try and find the leader of the movement, eventually discovering him in al-Humayma. Ibrahim al-Imam was then taken into custody, and so the leadership fell to his brother, as-Saffah, meaning the shedder of blood. Clearly, this was a man who was ruthless in his tactics, and under his command, the army of Khurasan was finally mobilized. The two armies met near Mosul along the greater Zab River, and while the Umayyads had an advantage in numbers, their morale was clearly much lower. There was deeply growing dissatisfaction within the Umayyad ranks, and some of the commanders even began blatantly defying direct orders from the Khalifa himself. Eventually, the Hashemiyya managed to defeat the Umayyads in battle, dealing a fatal blow to the already crumbling dynasty. The Umayyad army then deserted Marwan II, the last Umayyad Khalifa. He was then forced to flee the battlefield, and he headed towards Egypt, and eventually he was found there, hiding in a church before being overpowered and beheaded. His head was then sent to as-Saffah as an inaugural gift, officially making him the new Khalifa. It is said that Marwan II's head was kept as a trophy, just as the Umayyads used to do, and that a cat once took it as a plaything and began chewing on his tongue. But this was only the mildest of what Saffah did to the Umayyads. For when he entered Damascus after winning the battle of Zab, his crimes were so much worse. Just as the Umayyads had done to the Muslims of Medina, the Hashemiyya now entered Damascus, and for 3 days the soldiers were free to do whatever they wished. They pillaged and they violated the women, and they murdered the population, leaving a trail of devastation and destruction. This was a standard practice for armies in the ancient world that conquered their enemies. All laws would be suspended for a few days, and soldiers would be free to sack the city. Only now can we truly understand how vastly different the Prophet ﷺ was. When he conquered Mecca, only 4 people were executed for their egregious crimes, while the rest of the people and their wealth were all left untouched. It's unfortunate that even after Islam, many rulers chose to follow the barbarians in their war conduct rather than the righteous example of the Prophet ﷺ. However, one Hashemiyya commander by the name of Abdullah ibn Ali held a deeper grudge against the Umayyads. This was because during the reign of Hisham ibn al-Malik, Abdullah's own brother had been executed as punishment for a murder that he had committed. So Abdullah ibn Ali went to the graves of the Umayyad Khalifas, and he began destroying them, taking out the remains of the deceased and burning their dead bodies. Only the tomb of Omar ibn al-Aziz was spared, as he had been the most righteous. Muawiyah's grave, on the other hand, was destroyed, but his body could not be found, as he had been secretly buried elsewhere. Even in death, Muawiyah outsmarted his enemies. He surely foresaw the eventual fall of the Umayyads, as all empires eventually come to an end. Hisham ibn al-Malik had died only a few years later, so his body had not yet fully decomposed. So Abdullah ibn Ali took his body out and began lashing it in public before crucifying it and burning the remains. But this was not enough to satiate the animalistic rage of Abdullah ibn Ali. So he took 2 women from the family of Hashim, and he paraded them naked through the streets, and he led them out into the forest and had his soldiers repeatedly violate them until both of them died from their injuries. This is the result of revolution. With it always comes chaos and anarchy, as the filth of humanity feast upon the weak, and even the most moral of people begin to follow the mobs, joining them in their vile and inhumane crimes. This is why the scholars categorically condemn revolutions under all but the most rare of circumstances. They only bring massacres and tyranny to the people, and the beloved women of society are often violated in the most horrible ways. May Allah curse the filthy souls of Abdullah ibn Ali and those soldiers and grant them the most severe punishments for their crimes. By the time as-Safah arrived in Damascus with the Hashemiyya army, his elder brother Ibrahim al-Imam had long ago died in the Umayyad prisons. No one knows how he died, whether it was poisoning or execution, or even if he just died of natural causes. But now that he was gone, as-Safah became the official leader of the movement, as there was no one else to challenge him for the position. But what had happened to Ar-Rida min al-Muhammad, the chosen one from the family of Muhammad? This had been the promise of the Hashemiyya movement, that there was someone from the family of the Prophet ﷺ who would restore the Sunnah and bring back justice to the people. But what they now found instead was a Safah and the inhumane crimes that he had committed in Damascus. And now that he had won the battle and destroyed all his enemies, no one could stand against him. Even the loyal commander who had led his army was taken out of the picture. Abu Muslim was later summoned to the palace and executed. The people had been deceived, and now there was nothing they could do. They had brought in a tyrant perhaps worse than the last, and at that, as-Safah was crowned the new Khalifa of the Caliphate, and the shedder of blood would now usher in a new dynasty.
Why empires fall?
Ibn Khaldun was a Muslim scholar from the lands of North Africa, and in writing his masterpiece, Al-Muqaddimah, he founded the science of human society, describing how civilizations rise and fall. And as part of his life studies, he developed a theory on dynasties and how in only a few generations a dynasty could go from building a new empire to experiencing a total collapse of society. These 4 generations are as follows. Generation 1, the founders. These are the people who crawl their way through the difficulties in life. Though with their immense resolve and ambition, they slowly build something much bigger than themselves, bringing their families and their friends to a much better life. Think of all the fathers of great nations, or even just the founders of large companies. Each of them has an incredible story, often going from rags to riches. And because they weren't born into wealth, they know the true sacrifice of success. They also still remember their roots and are always grateful and never forget where they came from. Generation 2 are the builders. These are the children of the founders, and although they didn't have to go through the same struggles their fathers did, they are directly trained by them. And because of this, they still maintain the same work ethic as their fathers, continuing the work by building up from their foundations. These people also have more opportunities in their education and upbringing, understanding the world of both the lowest and the highest of society. They develop skills beyond the first generation, and they use them to consolidate rule, organize the armies, and reform the laws and build infrastructure across the empire. These people often bring empires and kingdoms to the heights of their power, though they also enjoy the luxuries of life and the fruits of their labor. Generation 3 are the inheritors. This generation is somewhat detached from the founders, as they have been completely removed from the difficulties of life. Everything was handed to them since they were children, though they are still trained in the traditions and the customs of the previous 2 generations. More often than not, the inheritors manage to maintain the empires of the previous generations, but with their lives full of luxury and no difficulties in their lives, cracks in the foundations begin to appear, and soon corruption becomes an inevitability. Generation 4, the destroyers. This generation doesn't understand the importance of discipline and hard work, as they've been given everything they could have ever wanted since the very beginning of their lives. They assume that they deserve their wealth and power simply because of their lineage, and they become arrogant and selfish, not considering anyone else. Their lives are full of luxuries and vices, and they are completely disconnected from the outside world. The people do not respect them, nor do they respect the people. And soon they find the empire crumbling all around them, while the people abandon them in their time of need. They spend their lives in shallow entertainment and decadence, while the empire remains stagnant. Little do they know that there is always another generation of founders in the barbarian lands waiting to feast on their dying empires. And soon they are replaced as a new cycle begins. One dynasty dies out, while another arises. In theory, the dynastic cycle should take around 160 years to complete, as each generation lasts about 40 years. The evidence behind this actually comes from the story of Bani Israel. When Bani Israel followed Musa alayhi salam across the Red Sea, that generation still had the mentality of slaves. They had no ambition or foresight to build a new society, so they were made to wander the deserts of Sinai for 40 years until a new generation would come and take their place. That new generation then became the founders of a kingdom in modern-day Palestine, and the cycle continued on from there. The Umayyad dynasty, though, lasted for only 89 years, and so their downfall came much quicker than the theoretical model. However, they had chalifas who embodied the 4 different generations almost exactly, though they had 2 special outliers who became the exceptions to the rule. Note that the Umayyad dynasty is actually 2 different dynasties: the Safyanids, which was founded by Muawiyah, and the Marwanids, which is founded by Marwan ibn al-Hakam. The Safyanid Umayyad dynasty. The first generation founder was Muawiyah. He began the empire from scratch, building his skills and reputation over 20 years of ruling as a governor. He then struggled through the first fitna before the Umayyad Caliphate could eventually be founded. The second generation builder was Yazid I. He was trained under his father Muawiyah in the art of politics and diplomacy, and despite his many flaws, he was disciplined and ambitious, willing to join the army and go to war against the Romans to pursue his own goals in life. If he had lived longer, he may have built the dynasty to something much bigger than his father, but he died after only a few years before even finishing the second fitna. The third generation of that dynasty is the exception, Muawiyah II. Normally, this generation would have enjoyed the luxuries they inherited and continued to maintain the empire. But Muawiyah II, however, was a pious man, and since he could not enjoy luxury due to his chronic illness, he gave up the caliphate entirely. The Marwanid dynasty. The first generation founder was Marwan ibn al-Hakam. He had to fight a war against Abdullah ibn Zubayr in order to establish his own dynasty. And while Abdullah ibn Zubayr had more rights to the caliphate, it doesn't take away from the fact that Marwan took the dying Umayyad dynasty and completely restored it from scratch. The second generation builders were al-Malik, Walid, and Suleiman. These 3 men took the caliphate from Marwan and built it to its greatest heights. They reorganized and restructured the empire, innovating and building new systems to make sure the empire thrived as it grew. They also enjoyed the luxuries of life, though this never interfered with their strong work ethic and discipline. The exception to the rule, though, is Omar ibn al-Aziz. Normally, Omar II would have been considered a third generation, an inheritor, but he put in extraordinary efforts to buck the trend and transcend beyond everyone else. If he had lived longer, his impact may have been so great as to transform the caliphate completely. That would have made him a first generation founder, though he died too early for anyone to continue in his path. Third generation inheritors, Yazid II and Hisham. These 2 inherited the kingdom and its luxuries, though they still managed to maintain the empire and not let it fall into disarray. Hisham in particular was an extremely hard worker, and under his rule, the Umayyads were able to survive another generation. The fourth generation, the destroyers, Walid II, Ibrahim, Yazid III, and Marwan II. Walid II began this generation as the most decadent and arrogant of all the Umayyads, though the others continued his legacy of destruction by splitting off and fighting each other. The collective values that had once held the Umayyads together were now completely destroyed by this generation due to the coups and counter-coups. This allowed a new dynasty to begin its rise in the outskirts of the empire. They were hungry and ambitious, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Eventually that moment came, and the founders of that new dynasty, the Abbasids, devoured the dying Umayyads. And soon they too would have their own cycle, eventually leading to the destruction of Baghdad by the Mongol hordes. Dynastic cycles are not limited to the rulers of great empires. Rather, each family or community has its own cycle with its own founders and destroyers. In the case of Muslim immigrant communities in the West, for example, this is especially clear. But the same cycle could also apply to any other family or any other community in any part of the world. The first generation founders. These are the founders of the Muslim communities who uproot their lives and sacrifice all of their wealth just to make it to a land with more opportunity. communities. There, they find no masjids, no halal food, and no organizations to help them navigate living in such a vastly different society. They don't speak the language very well, and they're often forced to find work in menial service jobs, such as being an Uber driver or a kitchen worker. Everything in their life is a struggle, and they are regularly discriminated against for their looks or for their religion. But because of their efforts, they are able to build a modest life, and eventually they can give their children better opportunities and allow them to excel in society. Second generation builders. This generation may not have been born in the country, but they most likely grew up in it. They can speak the country's language without an accent, while also speaking their parents' native language, though they may not be as fluent as their parents. This generation can then take the foundation that their parents built and enter careers that are much more lucrative and influential. They may go to university and become doctors or start their own businesses and become entrepreneurs. They still have that work ethic of their parents, but now they can go further in life and they can contribute so much more to the community. Third generation inheritors. This generation of Muslims continues in the path of their parents, though there is now a disconnect between them and the founders. Often this generation completely loses their original home language, and they only speak the language of the country they are living in. They also begin to develop arrogance against new immigrants coming in from the same country as their parents. Sometimes they'll call them freshies or fobs, fresh off the boat, thinking that they are better than them because they were born in a Western country. Sometimes this generation ends up marrying a non-Muslim local, and because of this, they cut off the next generations from ever experiencing the sweetness of Islam. This in turn makes them the last generations of Muslims in their family, as the next generation completely destroys the family linkage with Islam. Fourth generation destroyers. These people are often only Muslim in name, and in reality there is no difference between them and any non-Muslim in the street. They have completely assimilated to the local culture, and they know nothing about their past. Their Islam is gone, their heritage is gone, and yet they will never really be accepted by the locals, even though they have full citizenship. An example of this are generations of Algerians living in France. Many of them don't speak Arabic or Darja anymore, and if they went back to Algeria, they would experience a great culture shock. But no matter how hard they try to assimilate into French society, they will only be fooling themselves, as the French people will never accept them as true citizens. They are lost in a limbo between two lands, and their heritage is completely destroyed. But some of these people eventually return to their religion and rediscover their lost heritage, and those are the people who have the potential to become founders of a new dynasty in their lineage. They become the mujaddids of their families in both their religion and their heritage.
The Feast of Abu Futras and the last Umayyad prince.
A few months after the sacking of Damascus, the remaining Umayyads all understood that the revolution was now over. And so, when they received an invitation from the Abbasids to join them for a feast, they must have thought it was an offer of peace, as the Umayyads were no longer in power. But when they arrived and they sat down, they found the very same Abdullah ibn Ali who had violated Hisham and his own family. Abdullah ibn Ali now ordered the rest of the Umayyads to be slaughtered before they were even served the first course of the meal. A carpet was then rolled out to cover all of the bodies, and a table was set over it with chairs for the Abbasid soldiers. There they enjoyed a luxurious feast, while the moans of those who had not yet succumbed to their injuries could still be heard from underneath their feet. This event would be known as the Feast of Abu Futras, as it took place along the banks of the Abu Futras River in modern-day Palestine. No doubt there was an element of pleasure they derived from killing the families of their arch-enemies, but it was also a calculated move to ensure that none of them would ever rise up again and contest the Abbasids for the throne. 80 members of the Umayyad family, men, women, and children, were all present at the feast, but none of them had been shown any mercy or spared. Yet there was one prince from among the Umayyads who had not been among them. He had fled from Damascus long ago and had now made his way west, fleeing the caliphate. And from there, he would rebuild the Umayyad kingdom once again, but this time from his capital city, in the lands of Al-Andalus.
The script of this video was based on one of the chapters of my new upcoming book, The Entire History of Islam. An absolutely massive book dedicated to telling the entire story of our ummah. From the lost Muslim kingdoms of Spain and France to the great sultanates of Vietnam and the Philippines and Russia. This is our entire history, a compilation that has never been done before in the entire history of our ummah. This is the most important book of this generation. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And if you pre-order the book, I will literally write your name into the book as an honor for you, so that generations from now, people will read this book and know that it was you. You were the reason that this book could even be printed in the first place. So go to my website and pre-order now. And may Allah accept you as a co-author to the most important book of our generation. Ameen.